of us in states with a lot of rural areas, up front and center is our focus on rural America. And I think we all know a lot has changed since many of us got together last year. For me, there was a major change, and that is that I was officially displaced as the most famous Slovenian American in Washington, D.C. by Melania Trump. That's true. She was actually born an hour away from where my relatives are from in Slovenia. And as I said at the National Prayer Breakfast, every time I look at her, it's like looking in the mirror. So we have all had our problems to deal with. But I think what hasn't changed with all of this change is the importance of our rural communities. About 60 million Americans living in rural areas. That's equivalent to nearly 20% of the U.S. population. But when you think of it, the other 80% of the U.S. population rely on that 20% for their food, for their energy, and for so much of what they need to get by day to day. Those contributions are real, but so are the challenges. We know the challenges. Anyone that tries to use a cell phone in certain parts of our country, or if you're trying to send an email and you get to the top of the hill and then maybe it'll work. Exactly. I, at one point, was carrying 3 different kinds of cell phones with different service, so I could see which one worked where. We have a doctor in a rural area that goes to the McDonald's parking lot to look at his x-rays. And that's just not right. When you think of rural electrification and what we saw back in the last century, that's what we need to be doing in this century to connect rural America. Rural poverty. A lot of people that are my friends in the urban areas do not even imagine that rural poverty for kids is actually worse than it is for kids in urban areas. And that message, I think we focus so much on the Farm Bill, and I see from my friends from Minnesota, the head of the Farm Bureau and the head of the Farmers Union that are here with us today. We're going to work vigorously on that with our great Debbie Stabenow, who you'll hear from shortly, the ranking on ag. But we know that it's more than the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill has things in there for farmers, but it also has economic development, it has nutrition programs, and then there's a whole host of other things in law and funding that involve rural areas. And so that's why a lot of our focus today, where we'll hear from Steve Case about how we can get more investments going in startups and other things in rural areas, is going to be about that economic development part. I personally visit all 87 counties, as my friends from Minnesota here know, every single year. I've always focused on economic development. It got so tough in one county that I had visited every business, and our staff finally found a place I hadn't visited, and it was called Insect Inferno. And all it was a truck, and it had a sign on it that said, "Insect Inferno, we kill bed bugs with heat." And the whole idea was the truck would drive around and people put their mattresses in it, and they made me go in it. And that was when I thought to myself the words I had heard from someone once that said, you just don't go where it's comfortable, you go where it's uncomfortable, right? And I think that is a lot about what we as Democrats have been talking about. I'm not going to go into the whole last election, but clearly rural America wasn't that kind to our party, and we know mistakes that were made, but we also know how we can fix them. And this is really the start of that discussion, of broadening how we talk about rural America and making sure that it is up front and center in every single policy that we consider. So with that, I'm going to start introducing some of our great leaders that are here today. And I will start with someone from the heart of rural America, and that is our Democratic whip from the state of Illinois, and a major force on the Appropriations Committee, as well as the Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin.
Thanks, Amy. We've got a long roster of senators to say a few words, so I'll be direct and brief. Dick Burns over here from Kickapoo, Illinois. Thank you for coming as my guest at this meeting, a Marine Corps veteran from Vietnam, who was also raises cattle and raises hell whenever the Fighting Illini play. Dick, we're glad that you're here. My state is representative of the United States. We have a great city in Chicago, great suburban area around it, and a real rural America for the rest of the state, which is where my congressional district was. And as I try to reflect on the difference between parts of our state, there are obvious differences. Sparser population, but there are so many similarities and so many parallels in terms of the challenges that we face. When it comes to the health care debate, the reason we were successful on the health care debate is that we were able in my state and across the nation to bring together rural parts of Illinois and Chicago in common interest, in common effort. When we talked about closing hospitals in downstate Illinois, all of a sudden ears were perking up all over the place. In my part of the world, losing a rural hospital is a disaster, not just in terms of emergency and trauma care, but in terms of keeping and attracting businesses to the area. So we put together this coalition, city and rural areas, by finding common interests. We can find common interests too when it comes to the internet. You know, as Amy mentioned, in Minnesota, we can tell the story in virtually every state of those areas which don't have access to the internet. Not too far from her state and mine as well, Dodgeville, Wisconsin, a small town which might not have had any impact on the world, became the headquarters for Land's End. And the reason it became a headquarters is not only because of good highways and infrastructure, but access to technology. So we know that technology in rural areas can produce good businesses and good jobs. When it comes to the opioid crisis, there's no difference here. There's no town too small, no suburb too wealthy to escape this opioid crisis. But when it comes to responding to it, it's much tougher in rural America. There are fewer opportunities for substance abuse treatment, fewer opportunities for hospitals that provide that kind of care. And I want to close with, because there's so many my colleagues I want to have a chance to introduce themselves and say a few words. I want to close on an issue which seems like it's far afield, but isn't, and that's the issue of immigration. I feel very strongly about immigration. 16 years ago, I introduced the DREAM Act because I believe that these young people deserved an opportunity for justice and an opportunity to be part of America. We have to work to bridge the cultural and diversity divide between urban and rural America. And there are ways we can do it, and the way to do it is to get down to the basics. A fellow named Jack Valenti, who was an aide to LBJ, head of the Motion Picture Association, used to say that every good speech has 6 words, and the 6 words are, "Let me tell you a story." We need to tell stories about what immigration means to rural America, and I'll give you one to start with. At Loyola Medical School in Chicago, they decided to open up competition for their medical school to DACA students. All over the United States, students who were aspiring to be doctors and thought they had no chance finally had a chance to apply to medical school. The best and brightest applied. They didn't have special slots. They had to compete with everyone else. They took 32 slots at Loyola Medical School for DACA students from all over the world, undocumented, who want to be doctors. They had to promise, because Illinois was financing their medical education, to give us 1 year of service in underserved areas of our state, rural areas of our state, for each year that we help pay for their medical education. Well, I met one of them, and she's going to be at our luncheon, I believe, tomorrow. At least, I hope she is. Her name is Ima Saeed. Ima Saeed's family came from Pakistan. She's brilliant. She scored 90% on the MCATs. She's just an amazing young woman. And when I met her, I said, "What do you want to be?" She said, "I want to be a psychiatrist." Do you know how many rural hospitals are desperate for that specialty? A psychiatrist, someone in behavioral medicine? Do you know what that immigrant student, given a chance by our state to get her education and to come back and make a difference, would mean to so many rural communities in our state? That's a story I'm going to tell over and over. I hope you'll join me. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, Dick, and thank you for reminding us all about the importance of immigration. We have one town in our state with an unemployment rate of 2.5%, dairy farm there. There's about 100 immigrant workers from Mexico in there legally. They want to bring their spouses, they can, but the spouses can't work for 7 years. and yet the unemployment rate is so low in the town and they can't hire people. So I think that that is one glaring example, like we've seen all over the country, the need for not just fixing the DACA problem, but comprehensive immigration reform, which is important for rural. And I appreciate all the leaders that worked on that Senate bill, including one I am about to introduce. And the agreement that we had on agriculture and immigration was so important. We have here with us today Senator Schumer, who not only knows a little bit about rural areas from New York, he told me I couldn't tell his story of visiting all his counties. He's going to tell it. I almost would, but I would do it so much better. But I think that you know that he, not only do we have the New York apple, but they have got some pretty vibrant agriculture in New York. And not only that, Chuck Schumer goes everywhere in the country, and he never stops listening, and he never stops talking, and he has done a great job as our leader, Senator Chuck Schumer.
So thank you, Amy, and Amy does an amazing job. The fact that this room is so full is another one of many, many testaments to how good she is. I call her the natural. She is a natural political leader in the best sense of the word, and we're lucky to have her as head of steering. Now, I'm going to tell my story, and then Amy can try and see if it comes out better. So Amy visits every one of her counties. I visit every one of mine. I started in 1998 running for the Senate. I was running against Al D'Amato. In our state, like in some of yours, in Dick's state of Illinois, maybe in Minnesota, you have a rural-urban divide. And so in New York City, it's accentuated. So Al D'Amato said, Schumer, if he's elected, you'll never see him west of the Hudson. And so I promised, I said, God willing, I win. My first year, I'll visit every county. I did. I loved it. And so I did it I've done it every year since. And it worked. My first term for re-election, I had visited every county every year, and I carried, it was a record, every county but one. Of the 62 counties, I carried 61, including all the rural, upstate Republican counties. Now, the one county I didn't carry was Hamilton County. For those of you who know your New York geography, Hamilton County is in the middle of the Adirondacks. It is beautiful. Great lakes, great streams, great forests, great hunting, great fishing. But it's our smallest county. It only has 5,000 people. So the day after the election, I'd gotten 71%. I had carried every county but one. I'm sort of...
I wouldn't have added all that.
It's my story, Amy. In any case, I was sitting there and feeling pretty good. And I have a great chief of staff. He's been with me since I started, Martin Brennan, and he puts me in my place when I'm getting a little feeling too good about things. And so I said, Martin, sort of, it was a rhetorical question. Why do you think that I carried every county but one? But why do you think we lost Hamilton County, the only county? He said, well, that's easy, Chuck. I said, really? He said, yes. He said, well, it's our smallest county, only has 5,000 people, yes. True to your promise, you visited 6 times, yes. It's the only county where you actually met every single voter. But New York does have the 3rd largest rural population in America. 3rd largest number of people. Do you know what's number 1? These are counterintuitive because in the East, the rural population is more dense than the West. When you fly over the East, you'll see a little hamlet of 200 people every mile. You'd fly out west, So what's state number 1? Pennsylvania. What's state number 2? North Carolina. And state number 3 is New York. Now, as a caucus, and led by people like Amy and like Debbie who are here, we have paid very great attention to rural America. And of course, the lesson of this election was we couldn't do it enough. We can't do it enough in the future. So there are lots of areas where we are focusing on rural, because rural needs are different in some ways than urban. I've been very active in healthcare, being on the Finance Committee. And I always carried legislation with Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, to help give extra incentives to our rural hospitals. Because people in rural, you need a good hospital wherever you are, or people will not move there, will not stay there. It's God's gift to us, life itself. But in the modern medicine, things are expensive. So these machines cost millions of dollars. Well, in an urban area, in Chicago or Minneapolis or New York, those machines can almost run 24/7. But in rural areas, the health care to the individual is just important to have an advanced NMR machine. They can't. But the hospital still has to have the machine. So we've given extra subsidies to rural hospitals. Same with ambulances, because they have to travel different distances. Well, the same thing applies to infrastructure. You know, there's a lot of talk about a major trillion-dollar infrastructure bill. It's true. We propose that the federal government put some money out for infrastructure. This is not a new idea. The person who first came up with this idea, anyone here from Kentucky? Henry Clay. He was not a Democrat or a Republican. He was a Whig. And he proposed something called internal improvements. What was internal improvements? He wanted to connect the then far west, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, with the eastern seaboard, and the federal government actually built roads over the Appalachian Mountains. So this has been going on for a long time until recently. And the money for infrastructure has been dramatically cut back. And who gets the shortest end of the stick when that happens? Rural areas. You know, New York City has 20 people filing applications and looking for grants. Only in New York. Can't afford to have any. And so what we have proposed is two things. One, the President has talked a lot about public-private partnerships, you know, where bonding, you go to Wall Street and they bond something and you need tolls to repay it. None other than John Barrasso, conservative Republican from Wyoming, part of leadership, said if we just do public-private partnerships, you won't build a single road or bridge or water or sewer system in Wyoming. We believe there has to be real dollars there. And we Democrats, in our better deal, where we proposed a trillion-dollar infrastructure program, same amount the President proposed, but we want real federal dollars, they proposed a rural set-aside. So Ole in New York won't have to compete against New York City to get an important grant. Here's another thing we believe in, and you're going to hear a lot more from us on this, rural broadband. Franklin Roosevelt said every home in America, every rural home should get electricity. It was essential in the 30s. Well, just as essential as electricity was then, broadband is now. Take the Adirondacks in my state. People want to live there, young people. Great fishing and hunting, great hiking, great skiing. But if you can't get rural broadband, not just to Plattsburgh or Ticonderoga, but to the homes, because you need broadband in your home often to do these modern jobs, businesses aren't going to come. Okay? We will be talking about broadband, the same thing Roosevelt did for electricity, we do for broadband. Every rural home and every inner city home, a lot of the inner city homes don't have it either because they can't afford it, should get broadband. That'll be another one of our goals as Democrats. We have many. In everything we propose, we are mindful of rural America, that the needs and desires are the same, but the needs are somewhat different. And you will find out as we roll out our economic better deal plan that rural America will always be focused on, always. And so, and it also is a work in progress. If you have ideas of what rural areas need, another thing somebody told, it may have been Amy, little companies in rural areas don't have the ability to train people the way big companies do. There are jobs not go begging because there isn't someone to fill the job. The young people there don't have the training, so they go elsewhere. Well, we've proposed that we give companies, particularly companies in smaller cities and towns, a tax credit to train people as long as they hire that person at a good paying job. Not a deduction, a credit. And that will help these smaller companies do it. So you will hear from my colleagues on different issues. Up and down the line, we're looking out for you. I've learned that through my 62-county tour. I'll be visiting every county for the 19th time at minimum this year. I've learned it from my colleagues who represent large rural areas, and you will be proud of what the Democratic Party in 2017 and 18 stands for when it comes to rural America. Thank you. Now Amy's going to try to tell the story. No,
I'm not even going to attempt it. All right, thank you so much, Chuck, for your leadership. And next we have from the West Coast, our great Patty Murray, who's the leader on the Help Committee. If any of you followed this last year, she and Lamar Alexander successfully negotiated our school bill, which had been a decade in the making, and now this year is tackling the health care issue, and they've had some incredible bipartisan meetings with governors and others, and is taking on that issue, which you know is so incredibly important right now for rural America with the rates where they are. And with this, I turn it over to our great Patty Murray. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for all your work in putting this together, and all of our senators are here, but mostly thank you to all of you who are here for this conversation this morning on a better deal for rural America. And I especially want to thank those of you in the audience from my home state of Washington who've traveled all the way here. You'll hear them whooping over here. They know who they are. I've asked for their advice so many times on issues affecting rural Washington, including our wildfires. And right now we are working together on legislation to address some serious gaps in the way that the federal government handles wildfires, both before and after a disaster strikes, and how that plays out differently in communities where resources may be fewer and farther between than in our larger cities. And our collaboration on that bill is really a great example of how we can and should work together to find solutions that really make sense for our rural areas. That principle applies to every policy proposal we look at, whether it's tax reform or education or infrastructure, and yes, even health care, which I know many of you are focused on. So let me start with the issue that, as Amy referenced, I am spending a great deal of time on. That is health care. And I think we can all agree a big question right now is, how do we make sure that living in a small town doesn't preclude anyone from getting the care that they need, including treatment for mental health or substance use disorders? Our first step this year in this Congress was making sure that Republicans were not able to jam through Trump Care, which would have changed Medicaid as we know it and would have been especially devastating to our rural hospitals and community health centers. So blocking that was incredibly important part of what we were doing. And now we need to make sure it doesn't come back. And that is one of the reasons that I'm working very hard on our Senate committee. We are holding bipartisan hearings on ways to lower costs and stabilize the health insurance market so we can move forward on this issue and not backward. It isn't easy. And even if we pass something tomorrow, our healthcare system is not going to be fixed overnight. And there are a lot of challenges ahead, especially with so many programs that are critical to our rural communities, like our teaching health centers and our community health centers, which both expire in just a few weeks. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, but this is an important part of our agenda. Now, I believe that bipartisan work is possible. I have seen it before. I have worked with Republicans and Democrats, as Amy referred to, on the education bill to replace the badly broken No Child Left Behind bill. The bill that we got signed into law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, was born of collaboration and input from parents and educators in communities large and small to make sure all of our children, no matter where they live or how much money their parents make, have access to a high-quality education. Because as all of you know, education is key to economic opportunity. And we shouldn't wait till kindergarten to invest in our children. We have far too many working parents today, especially in our rural areas, where access to affordable, high-quality childcare and early learning is out of reach. And I want you to know that tomorrow we will be introducing a comprehensive childcare and early learning bill that will make sure that no parent has to pay more than they can afford on childcare and invest in early learning programs to prepare our children for kindergarten and beyond. And our bill specifically addresses the unique challenges that rural communities face by providing resources for communities to build new child care centers where there are none. Those are the kinds of investments that help move our country forward. And we also, as Chuck referred to, have to invest in our infrastructure, that big word that means roads and bridges and small ports and regional and general aviation airports and long-haul Amtrak service. Those kinds of investments that connect our rural communities, they create jobs and they move our economy forward. And as you have heard, it's why we need to invest in better broadband infrastructure to empower every American, no matter where they live, with economic opportunities. As you know, as senators, we travel across the states, and I can't tell you that we all understand this so well. We get a phone call, we can't take it, we're in one of our small communities. We know that experience personally. It's a critical part of our agenda. And I would be remiss in talking about a better deal for rural America without highlighting our farmers and our ranchers and our growers who sustain our rural communities in ways both big and small, not just in my state, but across our country. And finally, I know many of you are interested in tax reform and making sure that anything that we do works for rural America. We're not sure how Republicans are going to address this, but I want you to know that Democrats are ready to fight for tax reform that actually helps communities across the country, including our rural communities, and not just the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. So I know those are a lot of the issues that you all are going to be focused on today. I'm really thrilled you are here to help us move the ball forward. We all know that rural communities are essential to our country. I was born and raised in a town with less than 1,000 people. I know that the families and workers who call our rural communities home deserve all the same opportunities that are afforded in our bigger cities. That's our commitment to you, and we're delighted you're all here to share in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Patty. And then we have one more speaker from our leadership team before we hear from the governor, who's been so patiently waiting there because he's such a patient guy. That is Debbie Stabenow. And Debbie is, as I mentioned, the ranking our leader on the Agriculture Committee. She successfully ushered through the last Farm Bill, which was not easy at all for any of you that were involved in it. Was able to work with then Chairman Cochran and now working with Chairman Roberts in her very positive way with that big smile of Debbie Stabenow. No one can say no. And she also has negotiated over the years child nutrition agreements, biotech, some really hard issues that we've had. And it actually, every hurdle that we overcome makes me feel better as we head into this next Farm Bill negotiation that rural America has Debbie on its side. Debbie Stabenow.
Well, good morning. We are so glad that you are here, and I want to first thank Senator Klobuchar for the great work with steering and outreach and all the team, the staff that's put this together, and our leadership team as well. You've heard from my colleagues that we understand that in the economy, we are looking broadly from opportunities from every small town to every big city. I personally don't think that we have an economy unless somebody grows something and somebody makes something. And so and I'm very proud that that's what we do in Michigan. So I'm very, very pleased that I have Michigan leaders that are here today, and thank all of them involved in all the different areas we'll be talking about today. And I particularly want to give a shout out to Sheriff Larry Stelma from Kent County on the west side of the state, who's going to be talking about the opioid epidemic. And I know how critical that issue is for all of us, and we better be all hands on deck on how we move forward on that. I grew up in a small town as well in northern Michigan. I feel very blessed to have done that. I often have had people say to me in politics, well, isn't it weird that, everybody knows you when you're an elected official? And I said, I grew up in a small town. Everybody knew me. Everybody knew I was Bob and Ann's daughter. My dad had the Oldsmobile dealership with my grandpa, and my mom was the director of nursing at the hospital. The worst part, though, for me was that my piano teacher, who was the organist at the church, lived right across the street, and she always knew if I was practicing. That was not so fun. But growing up in a small town was wonderful, frankly, because we always knew somebody had our back. and was looking out for us. And that's really what our country should be doing for every child growing up in a small town, every child growing up in rural America. And I know for many of us now, we want to make sure that our children or grandchildren come back. You know, I left college, went in a different direction. I have friends that stayed or came back after college, and they want to know that their children or grandchildren will do that, which means having the hospital and the health clinic, which means having the connections with high-speed internet and small businesses and thriving farmers and infrastructure that you can actually ride on the road and water systems that work and all of that. So that's what we are very focused on, and I will let you know that as we go into the Farm Bill discussions, and the Farm Bill is really the 5-year economic strategy and plan for agriculture in small towns. Right, Roger? I see you shaking your head. Yes. And we do this every 5 years, and then we deal with appropriations in between, but it's the picture on food policy and agriculture and small town policy. It's up, as you know, next year for reauthorization. Senator Roberts and I are working very closely together. Senator Klobuchar is a very key member of our Agriculture Committee. We have defined this as a partisan-free zone. That's how we get things done. There are differences in commodities and regions and debates about policy. But we keep it to that. That's how we've been able to move forward. And I feel confident that the Senate will once again do its job, and we hope to get that done early even so that we can work with the House as we move forward. The Farm Bill is about a farmer safety net. Nobody has a riskier job in America than a farmer. I don't know anybody else who's got to check the weather every day to determine whether or not they're even going to have their business or what's going to happen. It's also a critically important safety net for families. And so both of those are key, and in between that is our economic development strategy, whether it's biomanufacturing and biofuels, whether it is what happens on the farm, whether it's rural economies and supporting small businesses to be able to thrive. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you as we go forward. I do want to just underscore one more time, and we have a great, I have a great guest here, Joanne Galloway from Pickford in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, who knows well, like everyone, about the importance of high-speed internet, because Joanne's been involved in her community where there is no internet access. She holds events at her local library to help high school students apply for college. And we have story after story after story of what happens when we have not fulfilled the commitment of connecting the farmer with the telephone at the end of the road or with electricity, and now we know that that is broadband, that is high-speed internet. And if we're going to have the connections for the school, for the hospital, for the business, for the home, if kids are going to be coming home to rural communities, then we have to make sure that is at the top of the list, and it is at the top of our list in terms of what needs to happen. So thank you again for being here. I believe strongly that everyone who lives in a small town or rural community needs to know our country has their back. Frankly, they need a better deal, and we're very committed to work with you to make sure that that happens. Thank you.
For everyone that doesn't have a seat, this is such a great problem to have. We have some chairs right here in the front, and you can use this moment while the great Senator Kaine is coming up to the microphone to fill in if you'd like. But I'm so pleased to have here to introduce the governor, Senator Tim Kaine. You may have heard of him before, especially the last year. And he's just someone that people, of course, listen to out in America, but he's one of those people that stands up in our caucus behind closed doors, and no one does our iPhone. That's a message to everyone. And everyone listens because he always has something important to say, and he has a lot of rural areas in Virginia, of course, and he also plays a real mean harmonica. With that, Tim Kaine.
Thanks, Amy. Hey, thanks, everybody. Good morning. And if anybody is going to be near Bristol, Virginia, or Tennessee this Friday night, Lamar Alexander and I, billed as the Amateurs, are going to take stage to kick off a big bluegrass music festival. So, just for your weekend planning, I want to thank Amy. I'm a proud Virginian, proud of our rural communities, and really proud to be here to introduce our great governor. Just to tell you something about Virginia, a story about Virginia. My wife's dad was the first elected Republican governor of Virginia. Linwood Holton from Big Stone Gap, VA, in rural Appalachia, elected in 1969. Linwood was from rural Virginia. His predecessor was from rural southeastern Virginia. That predecessor was from rural southside Virginia. Virginia governors were from rural Virginia. When Linwood was elected in 1969, 40% of the voters who cast votes in that election were from rural Virginia. 35% were from suburban Virginia. 25% were from cities. That was in 1969. I got elected in 2005. The last governor from rural Virginia was elected in 1985. So the trend of governors from rural Virginia had changed. I grew up in Kansas City. I was going to the farm. Both sets of my grandparents had farms, but I grew up in a city, and Virginia governors have been. When I got elected in 2005, remember in 1969, 40% rural, 35% suburban, 25% city. By 2005, 65% suburban, 20% city, 15% rural. Just in that period between my father-in-law's election and mine, the population of voters in Virginia went from 40% rural to 15% rural. And the trend of governors almost always being from rural Virginia had fundamentally changed. And yet we're a state where ag and forestry is still the #1 industry in Virginia, bigger than the high-tech Northern Virginia, bigger than coal mining or anything else. And so we are a state that's undergone a significant transition, and I imagine many of your states are like that. So how do you as a statewide official, how do you as a governor deal with that challenge that our rural areas are still driving our state's economy with ag and forestry, but the number of people, the number of legislative districts after redistricting are dwindling, the power of rural Virginia in a legislature, the power of rural America in Congress gets less? How do you deal with that? Well, in the words of our friend Joe Manchin, they don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. You got to show that you care. And that's why I'm really proud to introduce Terry McAuliffe to you. Terry grew up in New York, came to Virginia 25 years ago. Big, booming, excited personality. And he has made a focus on the needs of rural Virginia, one of the centerpieces of his administration. And it begins with showing people how much you care. It's not so much about the policies. We'll talk a lot about policies today. But if you have the right policies, but you don't have the presence and you don't have the connection, it doesn't really make any difference. And whether it's educational investments that Terry has made in our K-12 system, our career and technical education, schools, universities all around Virginia, but with a special focus on rural Virginia. Economic development, whether it's bringing employers or celebrating ag and forestry, and he's had a special passion for celebrating anything in the ag world that could be distilled into an alcoholic beverage. So wineries, breweries, distilleries, that's a huge part of our rural community right now. It's been really fun and exciting, and Terry has done a great job of marketing that. So economic development, battling for rural health care, battling for educational investments, but also dealing with the challenges. You know, we have an opioid crisis statewide like everybody does, and it's not a respecter of region, wealth, race, but some of the hardest hit areas of our state when it comes to opioids have been in Appalachia especially, and Terry has made that a focus from his very first day in office. So we're really fortunate to have a governor who is matching the Joe Manchin wisdom that you got to show people how much you care. Rural Virginia knows how much Terry cares. He's in his last year as governor. Virginia has that unique one-term governor thing. You can't run for re-election. The trade in Virginia is we're the only state in America where they call the governor Your Excellency. But you only get 4 years, because 8 years of Your Excellency would be hazardous to your health. But let me introduce our Excellency, my great friend, Virginia's fantastic Governor, Terry McAuliffe.
Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, you can do better than that. Good morning. Well, I want to thank, let's hear it for our great Senator Tim Kaine, a great senator, governor, lieutenant governor, mayor of Richmond, Virginia, and I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for leading this very, very important effort. I am the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, so when you go to bed tonight, think about this. Our first governor, Patrick Henry, who started the American Revolution, give me liberty, give me death. Our second governor, Thomas Jefferson, and now Terry McAuliffe. Is this not a great country we live in, folks? But it's an honor to be here today to talk to you about rural issues. As the senator talked about, when you think about Virginia, a lot of people think of Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads, what we call the Crescent. But once you go west, mostly rural communities. In fact, if you go out to Lee County, our furthest county, southwest Virginia, it is further west than Detroit, Michigan. So it's a long state, lot of rural activity. So when I became governor, I faced a couple challenges. Number one, sequestration. Virginia is the #1 recipient of Department of Defense dollars of all 50 states. #1. That's great when they're spending money. 27 military installations, the Pentagon, CIA, Quantico, the largest naval base in the world, all in Virginia. But when you have sequestration, it really impacts you more than any other state. And between 2011 and 2013, we lost about $9.8 billion of direct spending. In addition to that, in our rural communities, we've lost coal, textile, furniture, and tobacco. They have gone over the last 30, 35 years. In fact, I like to tell folks, we're a state of 8.5 million people, 4 million workers in Virginia today. We're a coal state. Out of 4 million people, how many do you think work in the coal business? Amy, out of 4 million, take a guess. Out of 4 million.
I would guess, I don't know,
1,076. Shocks most people when I give that statistic. So what I wanted to do when I came to office is to say, and I don't treat urban and rural different, the most important thing to every single citizen is a job, a good, high-paying job. Nothing else matters, because if you don't have economic income from your jobs, you can't invest in education, you can't invest in health care, you cannot build roads. I have focused everything on what I call building that new Virginia economy. Bringing everybody together, new what I call 21st century technologies. And it doesn't matter if you're in Martinsville or Fairfax County. A job is a job, high-paying job. And in fact, what I've really tried to lean on, some of those high-tech jobs, I need those in rural parts of the state, because that's what's going to replace those jobs. The end result, let me just say, has been spectacular. I'm very proud. Over the last 4 years, we have taken unemployment all the way from 5.4 down to 3.7, now one of the lowest of the entire country that we have today. This is after sequestration, where we lost 200,000 jobs. I just announced yesterday that our initial unemployment claims just hit a 44-year low, and I'm most proud that every single county in Virginia has seen their unemployment drop by 50%. You take our rural counties, Page County has dropped 7 points. Lancaster County has dropped 7 points. Extraordinary numbers. The problem I have now as governor of Virginia, I have too many high-paying jobs I cannot fill. And that's what we've leaned in. So how do you do it? Number one is education. Number two is your workforce development system, and providing a great health care and infrastructure. So what I embarked upon as governor, with my great Secretary of Education, Ann Holton, who is married to Tim Kaine over there, we realized the issues we had in education. Let me be very blunt with you, folks. High schools don't work anymore in America. They don't. They were built in the Industrial Revolution. We have all these jobs open today, but we're not teaching the skills to match the jobs that exist. I call it that connective tissue. And that's what we've worked hard on Virginia to do. So now we put up $1 billion to redesign every single high school in Virginia, to redo all of our K-12. Why? I've leaned in to bring cybersecurity. We're now the #1 state in America for cybersecurity. I have 650 cyber companies, more than any state in America. I have 36,000 cyber jobs open today in Virginia, starting pay $88,000. Don't need a 4-year degree, high school, and then some credentialing after that. I had 150,000 technology jobs open last year. All of those should be in rural communities. But you got to make sure we have quality teachers. I'm proud to say I've done 2 teacher pay raises. We hadn't done them for a long time. pay the teachers what they're worth. This year in Virginia, the only state in America, when you start kindergarten, K through 12, beginning in kindergarten, every kindergarten today teaches you cybersecurity beginning in kindergarten. I got rid of a lot of the tests that were worthless. We brought in computer science, computational reasoning are now part of the core curriculum of K through 12 in Virginia. If you're in high school in Virginia today, you get credit for internships, externships, on-the-job training. Get people out of the classrooms and get them out understanding what's going on today. Industry credentials, I've identified 140 in 7 different clusters. If you're willing to go get an industry credential, we, the state, will pay 2/3 of the cost. The only state that does it. But folks, if I can move someone right into a cybersecurity job paying $88,000 versus not having a job at all, that makes money back for the state immediately. Now, I know a lot of people talk about free college. I don't subscribe to that. Free college is not your answer. If you're giving more people a free education, but it's not giving you the skills, what good is it? We should be investing in building our education system to match the jobs of the 21st century. And that's what we've led on. So it's education, making sure your education system works for everyone, building your workforce development, and I'm proud that I've called for 480,000 credentials by 2030, 50,000 a year. If we do that, Virginia will be the #1 state in America. That is a great ability for me to go bring jobs in. I announced yesterday that last year, 50,150 credentials through our education system, the most of any state in America. And this has happened, folks, over the last 2 years. So it's building that workforce. It's also providing health care, which we've leaned in. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of great economic success, and I've brought in $16.6 billion of new capital. I'm the most traveled governor in America. I've traveled all over the globe. You want to talk about ag sales? I've sold chicken paws in China in front of millions of people eating those delectable chicken paws with that beautiful orange glow sauce they put on it in China. I've sold wine. I've literally taken cases of wine over to France, sat around with the sommeliers. That's a word I learned after I became governor. That wasn't big up in Syracuse. And I've convinced the French that actually Virginia wines are better than the French wines. I've sold oysters to the UAE, but that's what you have to do. Our ag business is up 32%, $91 billion I announced last year. $91 billion, up 30%. We went out, we've marketed it, but the other big piece is you got to provide all your citizens health care. I have been a spectacular failure at getting Medicaid expansion done. I've tried very hard in Virginia to get Medicaid expansion done. Unfortunately, my Republican legislature won't do it. 31 states have done it. To date, Virginia has forfeited $10.5 billion cash. I come from a business background. I've started 30 different companies. You give me in the business community, I have to pay $1, I get 100%, I get the whole dollar back. I'm going to take that any day of the week. This is really one of the saddest things I've ever seen. 400,000 Virginians will get quality health care. And I worked a deal out with Secretary Burwell. I got a waiver. Bring it all back to Virginia. I run it through an outside independent agency. The hospitals will pay the difference when it comes off 100%. It will never touch the state budget. What is your argument then? We know the answer. People are scared of Tea Party primaries. Unfortunately, I come from a business background, get in, do the right thing, and sort of let the chips fall where they may. The other big issue for us is infrastructure. Senator Schumer is right as it relates to what we're talking about. Virginia leads the country today on public-private partnerships. I have $10 billion under construction right now going on in Virginia, rebuilding our port. We now have the deepest port on the East Coast. I just invested $750 million. When I became governor, they were selling it. The dumbest idea I've ever heard. You do not sell your assets. I don't sell my port. I'm not going to sell my Dulles Airport. You just don't do it. I took it off the market, invested, and now we're cranking. Last month, the most containers of any port in America. The biggest ship that ever came through the Panama Canal just came through, Costco Development, came around the Panama Canal, came to Virginia, the deepest port on the East Coast, unloaded the containers, the ship rose, and then went to those dinky ports in Baltimore, New York, and Jacksonville, and just teasing, I'm just, We actually did get that big shipment. I know, that little, out there, those little ports. But no big port in New Hampshire yet. But that's how you do it. And as I say, folks, just let the numbers speak for themselves. We're pretty much at full employment in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If you look 4 years ago where we were in trouble. But as I say, let's just take cyber. I now have 17 centers of cyber excellence, which by the DHS is determined that. Danville Community College, wiped out. Textile, furniture, gone, gigantic warehouses. Now that they are a cyber center of excellence through their community college, guess what? They can get a cyber degree in 1 year, and I can move them right into a job that pays them $88,000. That is life-changing in Southside Virginia. It is life-changing in Southwest Virginia. Because they don't care where you live, as long as you have access to the pipe and you can code right. All my big, huge companies in Northern Virginia, they don't care. In fact, they'd rather have they want to have a diversified base, you know, to deal with electricity glitches and everything else. And as I say, it has worked spectacularly in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So my message is we are helping the rural community. You got to do it. You got to treat everybody the same, give them the educational opportunity, workforce development. You have to lean in on those issues, get them health care as much as you can, and finally, build an infrastructure that works for everyone. That's how you build rural communities, and it isn't just talk. We've actually done it in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The last thing I'll say, and we talked about ag a little bit, $91 billion last year, up 30%, huge growth. And Senator Kane mentioned this. I am proud to announce that I'm in the paper probably once a week, holding a beer or holding a wine. I know many politicians are scared of that. I'm not. I'm Irish. I apologize. But you understand 300 wineries in Virginia today, 220 craft breweries. Every one of these craft breweries, what do? They buy local, their ag products. We are at a point today where farmers were in trouble. Today, the craft brew business is booming so much, in addition to a $26 billion tourism income last year, they are buying every crop our farmers can produce. And they're having to go out of state for hops and other things. So I tell my farmers, redo your allocation. That's what these craft breweries have done. In addition to being a great time, great for tourism, it has been a renaissance for all of our farmers. So think about this. Last thing I'm going to say to you. 300 wineries, 220 craft breweries, 42 distilleries. We got 8 varieties of oysters. You come to Virginia, you eat our oysters, you drink our wine, our beer. Virginia's for lovers. You figure out the rest. Thank you very much.
Okay, I love that energy. And just so you know, Governor, if you look on my Facebook page, which I know you do all the time, there is a picture of me at a hops farm last week drinking a beer called Dangerous Man. So there you go. So, all right. So I want to thank the governor. I think that energy is so important right now. If any of you have felt a little down from our politics, I think you see that there are a bunch of leaders here that truly believe that we can move ahead, that there is a reason to resist some of the things that are going on, but there's a reason to insist on a better way forward. And one of the ways to do that is by focusing on this workforce training, apprenticeships, and figuring out where those jobs are in every one state, and then figuring out how we get students in the right track and the right path to fill them. And so we're doing the same thing, and I know someone who's with us right now, the vice chair of the steering committee, who is the first woman in the history of the United States of America, here's a trivia fact, to ever be both a governor and a senator, governed the state of New Hampshire quite well, and then came over to the United States Senate, where she's been a leader on foreign relations, specifically the European Affairs Subcommittee, which has been busy in the last few years with NATO and other things, and also has taken a lead on a lot of small business issues as well. I turn you over to the vice chair of the steering committee, the great Jean Shaheen from the state of New Hampshire, who will introduce our next panel.
Thank you very much, Senator Klobuchar, and thank you for your leadership on the Steering and Outreach Committee, and also in putting together today's Rural Summit. Okay, so I'm not going to give you the hyperbole of Governor McAuliffe. because he may have crabs and all, mussels in Virginia, but he doesn't have lobsters. And he's done a lot of great things, but I don't know that he can sell Virginia wine over French wine. But anyway, I am really here to introduce the next panel, which is on providing rural health care. And as we all know, the challenges of providing health care in rural areas are different. Often they're more difficult than in urban areas. Access to hospitals and recovery services are a challenge. Many of the facilities in rural areas struggle more financially. Patients tend to be older. They tend to have more chronic conditions. The uninsured rate has historically been much higher in rural areas. And, of course, attracting healthcare providers is very difficult in rural areas. What has made these challenges much worse in recent years has been the opioid epidemic. And we have seen that very personally and directly in the state of New Hampshire, where we have the second highest overdose death rate in the country. So we have looked at how we can deal with this for those struggling with substance use disorders in rural areas. Places to get treatment are few and far between. In northern New Hampshire, we have one inpatient treatment facility in a 65-mile radius. Now, the good news is that the Affordable Care Act has helped dramatically to address the challenges of providing health care for people in rural areas, and the expansion of Medicaid has meant that nearly 1.3 million Americans who are struggling with substance use disorders are able to get care. In New Hampshire, we've seen 11,000 Granite Staters who can now get care for their substance use disorders because of the Affordable Care Act. And of course, for rural hospitals, which often not only are the healthcare provider in the areas where they exist, but they're also often the biggest job provider as well. And for rural hospitals, Obamacare has dramatically reduced uncompensated care, so the number of people who are using emergency rooms who don't have coverage either through Medicaid or through health insurance. And it's also allowed them to better address the opioid epidemic. And I've had a chance to visit several innovative programs in New Hampshire that I think are really good models. In the eastern part of our state, bordering Maine, the gateway to the White Mountains community called Conway, North Conway, they have a hospital that's begun a treatment program to address prenatal women with substance use disorders. What we've seen nationally since this epidemic hit is that children born with substance use disorders are 4 times more babies are being born with substance use disorders than before. And so what the hospital has done is partnered with social service agencies and put in place a cuddling protocol. I had to use that term because it's one of my favorites. For those of you who don't know, the cuddling protocol means that one of the things that we've learned that works best for babies born to mothers with substance use disorders is to actually cuddle them against the skin for long periods of time. So they have not only introduced that, but they are working now with those mothers and social service agencies over the long term. So it isn't you get discharged and then you're forgotten. It is to keep the mothers involved so that they can long-term deal with their substance use disorders. Another of my favorite initiatives is one that Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, this is not a small rural hospital, but it has affiliations with a number of our small rural hospitals. And they have gotten a grant through AmeriCorps to have those AmeriCorps students work with people with substance use disorders, connecting them to affordable housing, to transportation, to other services that they'll need. I think that's a really another good model that may be available to many of you across the country. Now, of course, in order to continue these successes, we need to continue the Affordable Care Act, and we're working very hard on that right now, and hopefully we will have another chance to not only continue it, but to make it better. But that issue and many of the other challenges facing rural health care will be discussed by our first panel this morning. And we have moderating this panel is Mary Wakefield, who's the former administrator of HRSA, and she's the former acting deputy secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services during the Obama administration. She has experience as a nurse, a professor, and a government executive, and she's respected as one of this country's leading authorities on rural health care. She's been particularly focused on that issue. So at this point, I will turn the discussion over to Mary, to the other members of our distinguished panel, including Bob Casey, who represents the state with the largest rural population in the country. So we're glad he's going to be talking on this panel, and I know he will also be addressing the challenges of opioids. So thank you all for being here. Mary, I turn it over to you. Take my water and get out of here.
Thank you so much, Senator Shaheen. And I want to go ahead and ask the panelists who are on the health panel to join me right now, if you wouldn't mind, in addition to Senator Casey. That would be just great. I want to begin by saying that we are particularly fortunate this morning, I think, to have a lot of tremendous expertise in rural health and in rural communities. And I want to very quickly introduce the panelists. But as I do that, I'm also going to give them a heads up. As I'm doing their very brief introductions, I'm going to give them a heads up of the types of questions I'm going to be focusing on, or the focus of the questions for each of them. So in terms of the introductions, first, Senator Bob Casey, who needs no introduction, of course, from the state of Pennsylvania. And he's joined by another Pennsylvanian, Stacy Covey. Stacy has over a decade of rural health and rural hospital experience. She's currently the president of 2 rural hospitals, a critical access hospital and a prospective payment system hospital. Those are Troy Community Hospital and Guthrie Towanda Memorial Hospital. A heads up to both of you, I'm going to come back to you in just a minute for your perspectives on 2 really important topics. Medicaid, specifically, the role of Medicaid in providing coverage for rural families, and also the relationship between Medicaid and rural hospitals and the economic health of rural communities. So just want you to know that's what I'll be focused on with you. Of course, Senator Casey, you can add in anything else you wish. We'll also be interested in hearing from Stacy about some of the priority hospital concerns that you have, concerns that are facing your hospital and that can actually get in the way of your ability to ensure access to healthcare services for your rural communities. Next on the panel will be Senator Maggie Hassan. She'll be joining us shortly, along with Senator Hassan from New Hampshire, to talk about severe challenges and potential solutions around opioid misuse that rural families and rural communities are facing. We have 2 additional experts with really important perspectives. Michael Brumage, a physician with internal medicine and public health expertise, who is the assistant dean in West Virginia University School of Public Health, and he's also the executive director of the Kanawha-Charleston Health Department. And along with Mike, Larry Stelma. Larry is the sheriff of Kent County, Michigan, and Larry has decades of experience serving in law enforcement in both rural and urban areas. Both Medicaid and features of the opioid epidemic are highly relevant to rural tribal communities as well. So joining us to talk about that will be Governor Curt Riley. He's the governor of the Pueblo of Acoma. That's one of the 19 pueblos in the state of New Mexico. Governor Riley is also a pharmacist, and he's held some key positions in leading healthcare quality initiatives, as well as overseeing clinics in various communities across New Mexico. I'll be asking Governor Riley for his perspectives on some of the additional challenges that American Indian communities face in terms of access to health services, including access to healthcare providers. Well, with that, let's go ahead and kick off this discussion on the topics that I've mentioned. And I have questions, of course, for each of the panelists. We're going to bring this to a close, panelists, no later than 10:55, maybe even just a minute earlier than that, so that the next panel can start on time. Thanks again to all of the panelists for being here, and let's get started. Senator Casey. Pennsylvania has a lot of rural communities, of course, and you personally have been a pretty vocal advocate for the Medicaid program, especially over the last few months. And interestingly, I think through this time period of the last few months, Medicaid now seems to have an even higher level of support than it has historically. Would you tell us why you see, from your vantage point, why you see the Medicaid program as so important to rural hospitals and, of course, so important to the health of rural individuals and families?
I want to make sure it's very good. Mary, thank you very much for getting us started here, and I want to commend and salute your work in the federal government on these difficult issues over many years. We're grateful that you're here to lead us, and I didn't have a chance to see all of our panelists, and I apologize for that. I just ran in and grabbed a seat because I knew we wanted to keep things moving, but we're grateful to all the panelists. Stacy, we're especially grateful you're here from Pennsylvania. Whatever time I will cede will go to her, because she's from Pennsylvania. But she's got a tough job, as I know many people here do, so let me just be brief. I'll make two sets of comments, one on Medicaid itself, and then one on some of the acute, substantial challenges that rural communities face, but in particular, folks that are running rural hospitals or rural healthcare generally. I think on the first point, we had, as Mary indicated, an important, for some, I think, around the country, including politicians, a revelation that Medicaid is pretty damn important to the American people. That might not have been evident before. A lot of Americans did know that 70+ million people are impacted by Medicaid. For a lot of Americans, and frankly for a lot of politicians in Washington and around the country, we found out that Medicaid is not a they program. It's a me program, or a program for someone very close to me, someone in my family, someone in my neighborhood, someone with whom I work. So that was a good development, because now we have a much more solid foundation for the next battle on Medicaid, which will be coming either in days or weeks, but assuredly in months. And we have to ramp up again and fight very hard. The good news is we've been in a period of bipartisan cooperation, at least in the Help Committee, having hearings on cost-sharing reduction payments, reinsurance, the 1332 waivers, a good list of issues to be working on that should be the subject of attention, because there are some real problems there, near-term urgent challenges. But I'm afraid what we're going to get into again is another fight about Medicaid. So I am in a bipartisan spirit. I have a bipartisan spirit in my heart right now. But if they go after Medicaid again, both of my fists will come up, and I will fight to the end of the earth like I did and many others did in the last couple of months. I don't want to do that. I'd rather be working on real problems. Medicaid is not the problem here. We know that. Anyone who says otherwise is either deliberately misleading people, or they really don't understand what they're talking about. It's either one or the other. There's not a third option there. So, so far so good. We've had about 10 days of good bipartisan hearings in the Help Committee, and I want to commend both Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Patty Murray for making that possible. It's good for our committee, but it's even better for the country. So my hope is that we can continue on that pathway. Just a couple of words about the challenges in rural Pennsylvania, rural America. We have about 3.5 million people in our state that live in so-called rural areas. 48 of our 67 counties are, in fact, rural counties. Stacy knows one of them well, Bradford County, Towanda, the community from which she hails. I don't know if you live in Towanda or?
Athens.
Athens, okay, you're in, yeah, same county. But that's the picture of Pennsylvania And in those 48 counties, we have something on the order of 278,000 people plus who obtained some kind of health care coverage since the Affordable Care Act passed. About 180, roughly, of the roughly 280,000 got health care through Medicaid expansion. So about 180,000 rural Pennsylvanians got Medicaid expansion. The balance of that number, the other roughly 100,000, came through the exchanges. So a big population of people getting their health care in either by way of the exchanges or newly enrolled in Medicaid by way of Medicaid expansion. So a big number. What we tried to do in my office, and I know this is true of many offices, is to focus on what's happening in some of those communities. We produced a report this year in the Aging Committee. I'm the top Democrat on the Aging Committee. Often the committee will produce reports that are joint, meaning in this case, Chairman Susan Collins joining me in a report, or I'm joining her. Sometimes one or the other sides of the aisle produces their own reports. I had a report that had my name on it and Senator Martin Heinrich, who's the top Democrat on the Joint Economic Committee. It was a report that was released through the Aging Committee, the Democratic side of it, I should say, that discussed the impact of Medicaid and the potential cuts to Medicaid on rural hospitals and rural communities. Just a couple of facts from that report. More than 40% of rural counties in the United States rely upon hospitals for more than 10% of their employment. The average pay of hospital employees in rural counties is 43% higher than the average pay of other workers in the same counties. These are, as you can tell, very good jobs for lots of people. Rural hospitals often have operating margins of less than 1%. Sorry to remind you of that, but Stacy, but I know that's true for many hospitals in rural communities. Medicaid makes up, on average, more than 10% of net revenues in rural hospitals, and in a number of rural hospitals, it makes up more than 20% of their net revenues. So deep cuts to Medicaid would threaten the sustainability of those facilities, which means that Medicaid cuts could lead to lots of job loss. And I think that message started to get through in the debate, thankfully. We know that folks in rural areas, on average, tend to be older and sometimes sicker than folks in other communities. And you know the basic numbers on employment. In fact, I think at one point we calculated that of the 48 rural counties, we had, I'm trying to remember the exact number, but more than 25 of those counties had the following circumstance. The rural hospital was either the #1 employer in the county or the #2 employer. If we drop the bar down to #3 employer, so top 3, the number goes way above 25. I think it might actually have been 28 of when they were either #1 or #2 employer. So these are big, big stakes for rural Pennsylvania, rural America. When you add in the other challenges that rural communities have, that 20% of rural Pennsylvania has no high-speed internet, or I should say 20% of the people who live in rural Pennsylvania have no high-speed internet, no broadband. I was in Juniata County this summer, among the 32 counties I went to in August. Juniata County, 52% of the people that live in that small rural county in the middle of our state have no high-speed internet, more than half the people. Susquehanna County, which is north of me and near Stacy, 66% of the people that live in Susquehanna County, no high-speed internet. 69% of Sullivan County, no high-speed internet. You go across the state, and it is a substantial problem in rural Pennsylvania. It's especially bad for kids trying to learn in schools, really bad for small businesses trying to grow, and also bad for health care. In fact, emergencies. What happens in an emergency in a rural community when you need to have high-speed internet or be able to connect on a telephone? We had a circumstance in Bedford County, another rural county in our state, where you had a 32-car pileup, a rail car pileup, major disaster scene, which thankfully there were no deaths from, but they had to evacuate 1,000 people out of a very small town in a matter of hours. The good news is they got it done. The bad news is it was badly undermined by the fact that there was no cell tower for that small community. So when you combine those kinds of problems with basic infrastructure problems, bridges that are in trouble and lots of other infrastructure problems, with the potential seismic impact of cutting Medicaid, you can tell that in rural communities we have a set of substantial problems that we don't want to exacerbate by cuts to Medicaid. So I've rambled on enough, but Mary, thank you for allowing me to say a few words today, and we're grateful for the presence here of so many people that are deeply concerned about and engaged in protecting people's health care and helping rural communities.
Thank you so much, Senator Casey. And I'm going to come back to you after Stacy finishes her remarks in response to a question or two that I have for her, in case you want to add in anything at that point. And then I'm going to turn to Senator Hassan, so if that's okay with you. You too. Stacy, from a different vantage point than the senators, you're, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the chief executive of 2 rural hospitals. Would you share with us some of the priority concerns that you have as a hospital administrator? And also, because Senator Casey talked about Medicaid, would you add in on Medicaid? It'd be helpful to hear your perspectives about the impact of Medicaid expansion, the impact that that's had on your hospitals and on your community, and how you would be faring, if you could anticipate that, how you might be faring had Medicaid not expanded. So if you wouldn't mind taking the 2 parts to that question, priority concerns and Medicaid.
The priority concerns for Guthrie-Towanda Memorial Hospital include primary care provider recruitment. Very difficult to recruit primary care providers to rural communities when we're competing with the higher paying urban communities. Recruitment and retention of our workforce. Nursing has become difficult to attract. We're unable to pay the higher salaries that some of the cities are able to pay. And Guthrie-Towanda Memorial Hospital is a small PPS hospital, so they are not critical access. And the third, I would have to say, has to do with reimbursement in general. We see the issues related to observation versus admission status for patients. That's had a great impact on our small hospital. We've seen, some examples with the high deductible health plans and people being unable to afford to pay those co-pays, and so you're losing some of your reimbursement there. In regard to Medicaid, though, and Medicaid expansion, we certainly have been able to provide care to more people with coverage as a result of the Medicaid expansion. That doesn't mean that there aren't a couple of issues that we would recommend be addressed in that regard, but it certainly has helped. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, I would have to say, Medicaid programs have provided us some additional reimbursement for the small hospital and the critical access hospital.
Great, thanks. Senator Casey, anything to add in?
Nothing to add. Make sure I have that. Nothing to add to what Stacy said, other than to acknowledge I didn't see Senator Maggie Hassan, former governor of New Hampshire, so she's done one difficult job. Now she's doing a second difficult job. We're grateful she's here and helped us, or I should say organized today's event.
Okay, thanks, Senator. Keeping in mind the importance of healthcare infrastructure that Stacy talked about, and also the importance of the Medicaid program that Senator Casey spoke of, importance to ensuring access to healthcare services, particularly for rural communities, let's turn to talk about one of the biggest healthcare challenges that is facing a lot of our rural communities across the United States. And that's, of course, the epidemic of opioid use. This healthcare challenge has pretty sweeping implications for rural hospitals and for public health services, as well as for rural law enforcement. So with this part of the discussion, I'd like to begin, as I mentioned, with Senator Hassan. Senator, your home state of New Hampshire and states across the nation have really been grappling, as I indicated, with this devastating substance misuse crisis. On issues like these, as Governor Casey indicated, you have a really unique perspective, having been a former governor and now, of course, a new U.S. Senator. So could you, for us, outline how you see this crisis specifically impacting rural communities and what steps you think would be most important to take in terms of addressing it?
Well, thank you. And let's see if I can get my mic working first. Is it on? Is it? Okay. It was on? Is it working now? All right, thank you. Well, Mary, thank you very much for moderating.
Is that on?
Now it's not? Now it is?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. So thank you very much for moderating. And I just, before I address the question, I want to thank Senator Casey not only for his participation today, but working with Bob Casey in the trenches in the middle of a healthcare policy debate is one of the great privileges I've had since I've been here. Nobody can speak as articulately about the importance of Medicaid to both urban and rural communities as Bob Casey can. So thank you, Senator, for your leadership on that front. Look, I come from a state that has an awful lot of wonderful things going for it, but is also really disproportionately impacted by the heroin, fentanyl, and opioid epidemic. It is and continues to be, and throughout my governorship was, our most pressing public health and safety challenge in New Hampshire. And there are a whole lot of reasons that we are facing this epidemic. It didn't happen overnight. There are a whole lot of different factors that influence the development of this epidemic, and they're all going to need to be addressed in order to turn the tide and then beat it. But with regard to what rural communities in particular are facing, I'll just start with the following anecdote, because I was, during our homework period, up in one of our rural communities visiting an employer up there, and the owner of the business followed me out after I did my formal visit and told me that she had just figured out that one of her family members was suffering with addiction. He had in fact been living with her and her family. She had been giving him extra money when he would say he was behind in his car payments or one thing or the next, only to discover that he had been suffering from addiction for over a year and she hadn't seen it. And he was thankfully getting treatment in our neighboring state of Maine. But one of the things she was reflecting on, besides the fact that this had unfolded in front of her very eyes and she hadn't recognized it, which is a story you hear a lot, was that because of the small nature of their community and because he had developed his substance misuse disorder living in that community, it was highly unlikely that he was going to be able to move back there. Because for many people with this disorder, going back to the place you developed your addiction is a trigger of sorts. And so you're advised as you get treatment and enter recovery not to go back to the very place where you started your illness. For rural communities, that's a real challenge and difficulty, because think of how hard we are working to keep, this was a young man in his 20s, we're working so hard to keep young people in our rural communities to the degree that they are disproportionately struggling with substance use disorder. In a small community, that can mean you're losing a lot of people. And this was a story I heard from another person in treatment at a place called Friendship House in Bethlehem, New Hampshire. Friendship House in Bethlehem is the northernmost treatment center we have, which, if you know New Hampshire's geography, means there's an awful lot of our North Country, our most rural and economically challenged part of our state, that doesn't have any treatment centers at all. And she was saying that this was a pregnant woman who was dealing with addiction. She didn't want to go back to Nashua, New Hampshire, in the southern part of our state, which has the best treatment center for women who are pregnant, because Nashua is where she became addicted in the first place. So that speaks to the real need to have comprehensive resources for treatment throughout our states in every neighborhood. And frankly, it really reflects the need to have integrated health care everywhere we go so that people don't have to go to a separate treatment center. It speaks to the need over the long run of making sure that our medical providers have the kind of training they need to treat people with substance use disorder, recognize it, and then treat it. But with regard to standing up those resources right now in the rural parts of our country, New Hampshire's needs, I think, are reflective of many other rural areas. We simply don't have enough treatment places or providers in our rural areas. I think a lot of our treatment community would say we don't have enough treatment available everywhere in our state, but particularly in our rural places. And there are a couple of things that are really important. One is for the federal government to continue working with states to allow providers to do medically assisted treatment for more than the current number of patients they're allowed to. We lifted one of the caps, I think, in one of our bills recently, but that continues to be an issue. You get somebody who is skilled in medically assisted treatment, and then they've got a limit of the number of patients they can actually treat. And in rural America, that is really keeping treatment from some people who desperately need it. The other thing is the number of beds that you can have for inpatient treatment. Again, Medicaid tends to bar treatment facilities of more than 16 beds. And right now, given the size of our epidemic, that's a real problem. It's also a real problem because garnering capital to invest in bricks and mortars in rural America is really hard. And for whatever reason, a lot of federal resources can't be used for the bricks and mortar part of the equation. And that's one of the things that our treatment center, Friendship House, which by all accounts is a really old facility and is operating under a whole lot of waivers right now in terms of its physical compliance. But it's the only option we've got, and we have a lot of communities that don't have the resources to just build a new building that will quickly meet inpatient treatment requirements. We have to obviously consider to fight for Medicaid coverage, and Medicaid expansion in particular in my state has been hugely important to our capacity to treat people with substance use disorder. It also has been hugely important to treat people with mental illness, and since we know that mental illness and substance use disorder often co-occur, not always, but often, it's really important that not only Medicaid expansion and Medicaid dollars continue to cover those illnesses, but it is really important that as we go through bipartisan attempts to reform the Affordable Care Act, that we continue to have essential health benefits that will provide that critical coverage, since in the rural parts of my state, a huge number of people rely on Medicaid and Medicaid expansion for their health care coverage. We have to continue to support community health centers. In underserved areas, these health centers provide key support. We have to continue to work to build out broadband, among other things, so that telemedicine is available to people, particularly for treatment in this particular area. I'll close with a word about first responders and law enforcement. Look, this is a challenge that has both a supply and a demand side, and we have been focusing on the demand side a lot in New Hampshire because we have grown to understand that substance use disorder is an illness and not a character flaw. And we have learned from our law enforcement, who are some of the first people who came to me as a new governor and said, you can't arrest your way out of this. This is an illness. It is law enforcement who, on the front lines, I think began to come to that realization before many others did. So we know we need to stand up treatment, but we also are dealing with some very unique and evolving supply side issues, very smart, modern, and predatory drug cartels that are trying to expand the market for opioids each and every day, giving out free fentanyl when they can, lacing marijuana with fentanyl to get people hooked, making counterfeit oxycodone and Contin with fentanyl. When one drug dealer runs out of product right now, they're fronting each other product because they understand they have a combined and mutual interest in keeping people hooked. In rural America, the profit margin for these guys is much greater. And frankly, law enforcement, I haven't read a study about this, but law enforcement tends to be more sparse in rural America. It certainly is in New Hampshire. These are not communities that have historically had high crime rates. And so the supply side of this continues to be a real challenge. We worked in New Hampshire to get additional funding so that our state police could coordinate with local law enforcement. New Hampshire coordinates well with Vermont and Massachusetts and the DEA, and we have put together some really kind of groundbreaking collaboration in law enforcement terms around that issue. But all of this should not ignore the personal toll that dealing with this crisis is taking on first responders, not just law enforcement, but also our firefighters, our EMTs. If you are an EMT or a firefighter in rural America, you might be paid for your work, but you might also be a volunteer. You are likely to be responding to overdoses of people you coached, kids you taught, family members you know well, and right now you are often responding multiple times. So our first responders need a new kind of support that many of them, I talked with a group of fire chiefs just a couple of weeks ago, this is not what they expected to be dealing with when they went into the fire service. Now the good news is being resilient people and problem solvers in two of our large cities, in New Hampshire, our two largest cities are Manchester and Nashua, numbering 150,000 and about 90,000 respectively. That's big by New Hampshire terms. They have put together a program called Safe Stations and have basically said to anybody who thinks they have addiction, they can come to their fire station 24 hours a day, and we will do a warm handoff to either an emergency room or a provider. And that is helping not only people who are seeking treatment because they feel that they won't be judged at a fire station, and they know the fire stations are open 24/7. It's also helping those first responders feel like they're not just responding to the latest overdose, but are actually helping prevent overdoses and getting people to treatment and helping people get better. But we need to be thinking about first responders, both on the law enforcement side and on the public safety, the fire safety side and EMT side, because this is taking a toll on them, and it is, I think, draining some people from the service before they otherwise would be ready to go. With that, I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I thank you all for being here and for everything you do for our rural communities and for our country.
Thanks so much, Senator Hassan. You really teed up nicely the two parts of the next piece of this conversation, which is focusing on both that health perspective and also the law enforcement perspective tied to the epidemic. And so with that, I'm going to start with Mike. Mike, a physician and a public health expert. Assuming that West Virginia's healthcare problems in this area, in terms of the opioid epidemic, really probably mirror what Senator Hassan just described in the state of New Hampshire. But would you say a word, if you can, Mike, about whether or not you think there are particular unique features to this epidemic that play out in rural areas versus urban areas? And by the way, Larry, from a law enforcement perspective, I'm going to ask you that question when I come to you too in just a minute or two. So the first question, are there features of rural America that make it particularly vulnerable to this opioid crisis? And then secondly, Mike, if you'll answer this too, just a quick word about what you see that's working to overcome the problems associated with the crisis. And also, what else do we need? What else do we need to be doing, again, from the perspective of a public health expert and a physician? Mike?
Well, thank you very much. Is my microphone on?
It is.
Thank you. I'd like to, first of all, address Senator Hassan's remarks about first responders and feel that this is a uniquely vulnerable population. Our law enforcement officials and first responders are absolutely bearing the brunt of this, and this is an epidemic of compassion fatigue and burnout among that population. And again, going back to your question, Dr. Wakefield, about unique attributes, I agree. There's so few law enforcement and first responders in our rural communities. I think that's one of the things that's stretching that community to the breaking point. There are also other things. I think that while much of America has prospered, rural areas have been left behind. I'm certainly from Appalachia, so we've had the diminution of coal jobs, which are very important. We have an extractive industry state, so that's playing a role in this. But I think one of the unique attributes that we never really talk about is the role of adverse childhood experiences in the home of origin. And there are things that are going on, I think, in those homes of origin that we really need to talk about. I won't belabor the point. If people haven't heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, it's well worth taking some time. The Center for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice has a paper on their website that you can download that kind of explains the connection between adverse childhood experiences and the opioid epidemic. But there are other clear factors like poverty, like the lack of jobs. But even if you bring the jobs, there's so few people now who are qualified because they can't pass the urine drug screens. And so this is a really self-perpetuating problem that we have. This is the worst public health problem I've seen in my lifetime. And like Senator Hassan said, this didn't start overnight. It's not going to be solved overnight, and it requires really an all-hands approach. And it's not just an epidemic. We're not just talking about opioids, heroin, and fentanyl. This is also an epidemic, not overdose deaths. Last year we had over 50,000 overdose deaths in the United States. That's almost as much as the Vietnam casualties in 9 years of war. Hepatitis B and C are other epidemics that we have to face. Hepatitis C is now the #1 infectious killer in the United States. West Virginia ranks #1 with hepatitis B, #2, and catching up fast with Kentucky for hepatitis C. We do not want to become the next Scott County, Indiana, where they had 200 cases of HIV in a year, which will cost that community, the community of 24,000 people, over $100 million over a lifetime to solve. We have also, the other part, and I'll stop there, are the children who've been abandoned and neglected by drug-using parents. This is a huge epidemic that we're having, and it's flooding the foster care systems. We're celebrating this year, just this past week, the 20th anniversary of the Children's Health Insurance Plan. And CHIP reauthorization is an absolute must to help these vulnerable kids to have the kind of health care they need to be able to prosper throughout life. I will say that one of the things that has helped us tremendously in this fight has been Medicaid expansion. And we talk about access to care, which is an important point to make, but the other important point to make about Medicaid expansion is the expansion and the sustainment of rural health infrastructure. And likewise public health infrastructure in rural areas. For a lot of places in West Virginia, the only place you can go is a federally qualified health center, and they get most of their revenue from Medicaid. So I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Larry, most people might not expect a sheriff to be part of a rural health panel, but sheriffs across the country have been quite vocal in conveying their concerns about the toll that this epidemic is taking. To revisit the question that I asked Michael, if I could first start with that, from a law enforcement perspective, do you see the opioid crisis playing out differently in rural areas of your county or the country from urban areas? And if so, why? What's unique about it? And then the second part of my question for you is that a number of sheriffs have been pretty active in advocating advocating for the importance of Medicaid and Medicaid expansion. Can you give us a sense of the opioid epidemic in the upper Midwest and why you and some of your peers view Medicaid, the Medicaid program, as so important to addressing it, especially in rural areas? So the two parts to that question.
Well, thank you. I think the rural response issue is an unknown issue in America. I represent a county that's one of the larger counties in the state of Michigan, one of the largest counties in the nation. I have the second largest jail in the state of Michigan, so I am a large county, a large metropolitan county, but I have huge rural areas as well, and much of the opioid issue covers both metropolitan and rural areas alike. But in the rural areas, the number one issue probably would be response and response times. If someone dialed 911 right here in the room, don't do it, please don't do it, but if somebody did it, the response time to that emergency would be minutes or maybe even seconds. And there are many areas in my highly mobile county, highly populated county, where if you dial 911, it's a 58-minute response time. And if you're suffering from an opiate overdose or any other traumatic crime, just think of it, you're going to wait an hour for an officer to get there. And that's because, obviously, the revenues for those townships are poor. The revenues are down. They don't have the enforcement issues. And so response and responding to these situations is terribly delayed. And while everybody carries Narcan and we administer Narcan daily, unfortunately, sometimes you get there just too late. But I think another untold issue with the rural area are treatment opportunities. So you're living in one of these rural areas and you're facing an addiction issue. The individuals don't have the treatment opportunities one has in a more populated area. And so if you don't have the transportation or the wherewithal to get to a treatment facility, you've got one big strike against you. As you return to your environment, that's the number one cause of recidivism, is returning to your environment. A person comes out of a rural community, they only know a rural community, they have no other place to go back to, so they go right back to the same environment and soon are back into a recidivism state. And in a rural environment, you don't have the mentor-mentee, which is probably one of the highest rates, very high in reducing recidivism, is a good mentor-mentee relationship. And you don't have that in a rural community. And so returning to that environment is a problem. You got two strikes against you. And the third strike is you're not going to get employment. Most rural opportunities for employment are somewhat hazardous, whether it's in the logging industry, the mining industry, the farming industry, driving trucks and equipment. And those are businesses that you just can't have a drug history in. And so employment's going to be a big problem. And all of a sudden, an individual that's trying to help themselves get out of an addiction issue, they've got three strikes and they're just barely starting. The answer, yes, I agree with the good senator. We're not going to wrest our way out of this. That might sound strange coming from a cop, but yeah, decades, almost a half a century of doing this. And we're not going to wrest our way out of it. And we're not going to treat our way out of it either. The solution that I see is we need to have a strong focus on education and prevention. It's a three-legged stool. This is rural America here. You all know what a three-legged stool is about. That first leg on that stool has got to be prevention and education. And I would just ask you, when was the last time you were watching an NFL game or the World Series or any other television program and you saw a PSA encouraging kids not to get involved in drugs? The education prevention component has virtually been eliminated in our society, both by the media and by society itself. It's been desensitized, it's been legalized, it's been popular activity, and right now being a drug dealer in music and movies is more honorable than law enforcement or being a senator for that matter, but it's the thing to do, and we have got to change that. We've got to change that perspective on drugs and drug dealing in this community, and it's going to start with education. We have lost 2 generations, and if we started today, we're still going to lose a 3rd generation. But education has got to be that first excuse me, leg. The second leg being treatment, because not everybody is going to adhere to the education, but treatment has got to be the second leg of that stool. And enforcement, the only unit that's really pursuing this matter full-time now, really has to be the third leg. We're the backup. We're the incentive for those persons that don't want to follow education, don't want to follow treatment. There has to be some teeth to the program, and that has to come through enforcement. And that gets into the Medicare expansion. Why do sheriffs, almost universal, 3,000 of us across the country, and almost universally, the sheriffs are supporting Medicaid for corrections. And obviously, the very first thing is that when a person's on Medicaid, they come into corrections, they're automatically cut off from Medicaid, and those expenses, and 60% of my jail population has a substance abuse issue of some sort. And then on top of that, the mental health issues and the psychotropic medications, those are all paid for by your local tax dollars, and you all pay local tax dollars, and a large percentage of it is going to the health care inside your correctional facility wherever you live, any state in America. And you're paying for that, and Medicaid is cut right out. And so a lot of your initial dollars go there, therefore your county doesn't have the money to help do the co-funding of rural development or other programs that they would like to do in their community. But I think an unknown, the second unknown component to that Medicaid expansion is that really sheriffs don't want a jail. We don't want a lot of people in our jail. I'm not proud of the fact that I have a big jail and a lot of people in it. And the fewer people I have in my jail, the better. So we put a great emphasis on reentry programs. And when people who have addiction issues are leaving the jail, we want a program in place. We call it a discharge plan. But unfortunately, these individuals, as they are discharged from the jail, they don't automatically go back on Medicaid. It can take 30 to 60 days if they find the right support people on the outside to help them get back into Medicaid before they're back on Medicaid. And so it's a reoccurring cycle. They come out of jail, they were on Medicaid when they went into jail, they come out of jail, they're not on Medicaid, they don't pick it up again, they recidivate, and they're right back in the jail. And so this continuation of care, there's a huge break in the continuation of care when they're incarcerated and coming out of incarceration, and Medicaid is a tremendous asset to that.
Great. Thanks so much for those perspectives, Larry. And now I want to go ahead and just shift to our last speaker for the last few minutes that we have to talk about another very important rural population. And that, those populations across the country, American Indian populations. Governor Riley, I'm guessing that you probably would also have a comment about the opioid epidemic. In addition, though, to that, if you wouldn't mind saying just a word in terms of American Indian populations, what you see from your experience to be some of the greatest challenges in terms of accessing healthcare services in those rural tribal communities. What are those challenges, and do you have a recommendation or two about what you think could be done in order to better address those challenges that create barriers in individuals and families getting to healthcare when they need it?
First of all, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's family is doing well this morning. That's my traditional greeting from the Pueblo of Acoma. But thank you for the question, Ms. Wakefield. I do not attempt to represent all Native Americans or Alaska Natives. There are 562 recognized federal tribes in this country. There are 25 distinct reservations within New Mexico, and I only represent one of 20 pueblos, 19 pueblos, I'm sorry, within the state of New Mexico. I'm just going to give you a very brief profile of my pueblo. It sits on 500,000 acres. There are about 5,000 registered Acomas. in 4 villages, one of which is our traditional home, Hago, which translates to the place prepared. It sits atop a 365-foot mesa top. There is no running water or electricity there. It's like going camping when we go back there for our traditional events. It is also on the U.S. National Registry for Historic Places, and it is a U.S. National Historic Landmark. So please come visit us when you have the opportunity to come to New Mexico. I sat in the audience from the very beginning, and it surprised me very much that some of the rural issues that everyone talked about, ditto on the reservation ×2. We, at least in my administration, just a brief note on that, we are still a traditional form of government. I do not run for my office. I am not elected by my people. Our religious societies look at the population and choose a person to serve as governor for 1 year. I am very honored to have been reappointed a second term, which is very unusual. I try my best to care for all of my people, wherever they may be. So we've been pushing four important pillars. And the whole emphasis of this, much like yourselves, is I want my people to come home. I want my young people to be able to raise their children on the reservation. What prompted that last year was as you heard me speak, my language. We're losing our language. I recently declared a state of emergency on our language. And so what would bring any small rural community's children home? You can ask yourselves that. Housing. Housing is a must. Economic development, jobs for those individuals to come home to once they start raising their family, education, public health and safety, and more importantly now, as everyone knows, broadband access. We are struggling with those things on the reservation. I guess a little bit about myself. During my high school years, the uranium mining industry was very big in Cibola County, where our pueblo resides. My father asked me, "What are you going to do, son, once you graduate from high school?" I was at boarding school at the time, and I said, "I want to work in the mines," because I saw that as economically feasible, I guess you could say. My father said, "No, you are not going to work in the mines. You're going to get an education, because with that diploma, you will be able to use that for the rest of your life." And it's proven so for me. I would hope the same for my people. But because we have a trust relationship with the federal government, most of our services, from the Bureau of Indian Education to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Department of Health and Human Services, the Public Health Service, Indian Health Service, those cover our education component, our health care, our law enforcement. And so we are at the whim, I guess, of Congress, unfortunately. The American Health Care Act really scared me. I saw the repeal and replace as very adversely affecting health care on my reservation. Everything that everyone said before rings with me. And it is unfortunate as well. Our problem is starting on the reservation with the opioid crisis. We have a large number of borders to cover, and we are very concerned as to where it's coming. So with us, our uniqueness is that we struggle to try to find a way to work with the states. So those of you that are in states which have your tribes, please reach out to the states, from the states and to the tribes, work with them. In Cibola County, we are a gaming tribe, although the market is being saturated. However, in saying that, we are the #1 employer in Cibola County. we can be an economic boom within your states. So please reach out to your tribes respectfully, talk to them, and you'll find that you have mutual concerns and issues. And Medicaid expansion is very, very important for small rural hospitals. And even our lone IHS facility, we do not get enough funding from the federal government to operate that facility. However, it survives because of third-party revenue. So we do have some unique issues, but similar issues to those of you that are living in rural America. So with that, I'll end because I know you're pressed for time. Thank you.
Such an important set of perspectives, though. Thank you so much, Governor Riley. And please join me in thanking all of the panelists as I introduce Senator Manchin to come join us.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm on.
Thank you, you're on, sir.
I was going to thank Mary for that fine introduction, but I never heard it. So we're going to get right into it. First of all, let me thank you all for coming. I know that, how many come here often? How many frequently come to Washington twice a year? Once a year? The rest of you are lucky as hell. Let me tell you, this is not a place where you're finding a lot of agreement. The toxicity is real. So how do we get past it? Healthcare, I don't need to tell you about healthcare. And we're here talking about rural healthcare. My state of West Virginia is the most rural state in the nation. I don't have one town over 50,000 population. Not one town. So I am a state of a bunch of towns. I don't have a city. My Charleston area is the largest metropolitan area we would have. If you put all the people together in that little Kanawha Valley, about 200,000. So people talk about telehealth. I said, don't you think you ought to have cell service first? Don't you think you ought to be thinking about a little bit more than when we talk about rural, what ARC can do, what the USDA can do, things that we don't use very much? It doesn't make any sense at all. We're not connecting the dots at all. We're talking way above that. Now, if you happen to live in an urban area, you're probably in pretty good shape. You're probably connected pretty well. In 1930s, if you would have lived in Pittsburgh and New York and Chicago, wherever it may be, you probably had electricity. So guess what? FDR comes in and says, I got to do something. I got to move this country forward. I got to electrify the country. We had rural electrification. That was his big push. We should have the same amount of effort and push right now as rural broadband connectivity as we did rural electrification in 1930. If you want this country to go into the 21st century and be able to compete, not have abject poverty, you got to do it. You got to give us access. So we're working on that. That's the crux of what we're doing right now. 60 million Americans live in rural communities. 60 million. That's a heck of a chunk of people that basically are pretty self-serving. I mean, they'll take care of themselves. It doesn't take a whole lot. They're not high need, and they're not demanding, and they give a lot more back than what they receive. But they would like to have some access to these to the opportunities and the quality of care. We're in a quagmire what to do on health care. I'm going to very quickly on health care. If you were going to repeal health care and you're a Republican, you say, I want to repeal, then you should have defeated Barack Obama in 2012 before it got entrenched into 6% of our economy, or about 18% of the national economy. Once it got entwined into our economy, who we are, from our rural hospitals, rural clinics, to the docks, to everybody involved in this, you couldn't unwind it. Because you do, the threat of collapsing our economy is real. Now, with that being said, why don't you just fix it? Why can't we repair it? So let me give you what we're looking for. We know that the private market's going to collapse. They knew it was going to collapse in 2010 when they voted for it. Couldn't get the votes back then. So they voted, okay? I'm a governor at that time. I was head of the National Governors Association. So we're talking. I got on the phone call, and Max Baucus was on it, and he was explaining what they were going to do and the mandates, and on and on. I said, now, Max, let me make sure I understand. You're going to tell me I got to tell West Virginians they got to buy a product, whether they like it or not. They're going to pay a price, and if they don't, you're going to fine them. Our logo, our motto in West Virginia is Montani Semper Liberi. Mountaineers are always free. You can imagine how that went over back home. Now, with that being said, we knew we had a problem there, so we had to fix that. Well, you can't fix the market if 5% of the population of America is using 50% of the healthcare dollars. You can't book that. I can't ask Nick the Greek to do that in Las Vegas. He can't book that. So we've got to bite the bullet and take our pre-existing condition, our chronic illnesses, and reinsure that. So that the insurance markets will say, okay, I've got a backstop there, but I can take all this population base and really have competitive rates. And then we've got to hold people accountable. If you don't care what you eat, if you don't exercise, and you like to smoke like a freight train, then by God, you're going to pay a little more. That's just a fact of it. I'm not afraid to say that. And I've got a state that's very obese. So we've got to do things, and we've got to get people kicked into the 21st century. And you can't expect everything for nothing. You know, my grandfather used to said, life is like a bank. You can only take out what you put in. I can't expect to live 85 years of a healthy lifestyle if I done abused myself for 60 of those years. I can't expect it. So what you all do in facilitating ARC and USDA, and we underutilize that. I mean, really, that is a gateway to taking care of abject poverty and trying to move in a different direction, even though we haven't been successful. The politics of what you're dealing with, so I said, okay, let's look at the health care law. It's been out there long enough that we know some successes and we know a lot of the failures. Successes. Backstop. I just told about backstop with the chronic illnesses. Alaska. Anybody here from Alaska? That's a long way away. They've done a good job. Alaska's kept their increases 7%. Been extremely, extremely successful. Now, we expanded. 180,000 West Virginians got health care for the first time. I told President Trump, I said, Mr. President, they don't know how they got it. They don't know who gave it to them. They don't know it was a Barack Obama. It was a Democrat initiative. They voted all Republican last. They voted for you. Let me tell you one thing, Mr. President. They're going to know who takes it away from them. They'll definitely know that. They don't know how they got it, but they're going to know who took it away. Now, with that being said, we got 20 million people in America that got health care coverage for the first time. Up until that time, you know how they've been using health care? Emergency room. If they worked for somebody, you know what they do? They got hurt on the weekend? They'd hobble into work and claim workers' comp on Monday. We know how the system worked before. It didn't work. The highest cost of delivery. So we gave 20 million people health care, the greatest wealth card they could ever get as a health card. That's the greatest wealth we can give a person. I said, you can buy a box of Cracker Jacks in America, anywhere in America, buy a box of Cracker Jacks, open the Cracker Jack box, get the prize inside, and it'll tell you instructions how to use the prize. We gave 20 million people the greatest gift, not one word of instructions how to use it. All they know is, hey, I'm not feeling like I guess I got to go to the emergency room. We're not doing anything to manage this, hold people accountable and responsible. Guess which state has done a pretty decent job? Indiana. Anybody here from Indiana? See, they're so busy right now in Alaska and Indiana, they couldn't even attend this conference. But so we're looking at successes, and you have to grab what you can and improve on it. But throwing something out in the most toxic environment politically as you've ever seen in your lifetime and in my lifetime doesn't make any sense. You can throw it out with a simple majority, 51 in the Senate. You can't replace it unless you have 60. It's the way our Senate works. Why would I throw something out that we all agree on? We can find agreements. And if we have a pathway forward, it'd be absolutely ludicrous for us to do that. And I only say this. I don't know, the identity of being a D or an R, people were so sick and tired. I had a person went to me, and the lady says, you know, what's your politics? I says, why would you care what my politics? Why don't you worry about what my purpose of being here? Why don't you worry about my reasoning for asking you to support me? Why don't you worry about that? Why don't you ask me what I'm going to do and how I'm going to improve things or make it better? Why do you care? Do you think the D's have all the answers? Do you think the R's have all the answers? I guarantee you that doesn't happen that way. And our founding fathers, thank God that they had the sense to put together the checks and balances that have kept us on autopilot for a long time. But we're about ready to run out of battery power if we don't do something. So I've said this, we can all come together. We can all come together. You have to be fiscally responsible. We can't, 20 trillion, you know, we had $20 trillion 2 days ago? $20 trillion of debt. Can you imagine what that does to your children? Steve's going to talk, I'm sure Steve, you'll touch on this, but right now we're on a projectile to go to $31 trillion of debt by 2027 or sooner. If you have, I have 10 grandchildren. If you have children or grandchildren, go back and look at those beautiful little children and say, guess what, honey, this is what I'm going to give you a gift. It's to really take care of you in your life. Your generation is going to be wonderful. No one's ever done that to us, but yet we're doing it unconscionably. And it just tears me apart. And I told the president last night, I said, Mr. President, the one thing that I can tell you that I am not voting to add more debt. We've got to have a pathway forward to bring down this debt. If you want to blame Democrats, go right ahead. In the last 57 years, Democrats have been in control 27 years. 24 of the 27 years, they ran deficit, 89% of the time. And if you're a Democrat and you want to blame Republicans, go right ahead. The other 30 years of those 57 years, they've been in control. And guess what? 27 years, they've ran deficits, 90% of the time. I asked my grandfather one time, I said, hey, Papa, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican? And he was thinking. And Papa said, Joe, he said, I really don't know. He said, I know one thing, though. You put a bunch of money, tax dollars, in the middle of the table, the Democrats and Republicans will both spend it all. Now, Republicans might feel bad about it, but they'll both spend it all. And that's pretty true. But the bottom line is this. I'm here to introduce Lisa Mensa. And I'm honored to introduce our moderator for our second panel. And they think I've cut into their time, so I got to get off real quick. Lisa is President and CEO of Opportunity Finance Network and the former Undersecretary of Agriculture for Rural Development during the Obama administration. OFN is a critical group of community development financial institutions. The CDFIs filling a large need that just isn't met in many rural areas. I am always excited to hear the success stories of CDFIs in West Virginia. And I look forward to the discussion and working with my colleagues to continue growing our economy. And I know all of you do too, or you wouldn't be here. So let's give a warm welcome to Lisa Mensa. Lisa.
Wonderful. Thank you, Senator Manchin. Let's give Senator Manchin a big clap, too. It may be a rainy day, but you got the right ticket today. We're focusing on rural America, and all of you who are passionate about rural America like I am know that this town doesn't focus on rural America enough. So it is a great compliment to be here, and thank you to Senator Klobuchar and others for putting this wonderful summit together. Now, we get the great part of this discussion. It's the better deal, growing the economy in rural America. This is one of my favorite themes, because I think that when we talk about growing our economy, if we don't look to rural America, we can't grow all of America. So this is a powerful moment, and we've got a great group of senators who are going to be with us, as well as a wonderful panel. You're going to recognize the senators, so I'm going to start by saying some of the panelists. We've got 4 panelists. Darren Van Ruden. Darren from Wisconsin is a dairy farmer and serves as president of the Wisconsin Farmers Union and on the board of the National Farmers Union. So welcome, Darren.
Thank you.
Mike Dolezal. Mike is, Mike, are you here? Yes, great. Mike is the general manager for Range Telephone Cooperative, based in Forsyth, Montana, which provides communications in the states of Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Colorado. Mike's been working at the telephone industry for over 37 years. I was proud to see you were a former USDA employee, general field representative for our U.S., and he's currently the president of the Montana Telecommunications Association. Jim Wessing. Jim is the president of the Condax Corporation, based in Lamira, Wisconsin. Condax is a manufacturer of precision equipment with annual sales of over $45 million, both in the U.S. and international. And Jim co-founded Condax in 1994. So we not only have a leading manufacturer, but he brings the perspective of a founder, an entrepreneur, which connects us to our future panel, which Steve Case and Senator Klobuchar will be doing. And finally, Curtis Wynn. Curtis has been the president and CEO of Roanoke Electric Cooperative since '97. And Roanoke Electric is based in northeastern North Carolina and serves a population base of over 14,000 members in the counties of northeastern North Carolina.
Roanoke is very known for its innovative leadership on issues of energy efficiency, and Curtis also serves as the Vice President and Board of the National Rural Electric. So welcome to our panelists and welcome to our senators. I got the great pleasure of traveling and meeting most of these senators, and it is really fun to be back together again. So, Senator Baldwin, we're going to start with Wisconsin. Your team said you wanted to hear from the dairy farmer first. So I'm going to let your colleague, Darren, usually, we're not here to talk about milk prices. We are here to talk about what it's like for farmers when they don't have the transportation or broadband or water, or things that have been coming up. And I hope, Darren, you will say a few words, and then we'll bring on Senator Baldwin.
Okay. Is the mic on?
They'll get it.
It's not sure. Okay, there we
Yeah,
go. Yes, thank you very much. Just a little background on my history, too, if I could, quick. A third-generation dairy farmer in '07 switched to organics because of the economics, and have kind of struggled through all of the processes of trying to make sure it's a profitable business. Our local telephone cooperative has installed fiber optics, so myself and rural broadband is not really an issue. But I do have a sister-in-law that's about 7 miles away from us, and they do not have that kind of a hookup. They're on a satellite feed for their broadband, and there's my brother-in-law switched a job about 9 months ago and is required to send in orders on a daily basis to satisfy the needs of his job. There was one particular Saturday morning that he thought he'd jump ahead of the game and try to get his order in early, and started his computer up, looked at it. There was 1 bar there, so he decided to go out and mow lawn. Came back after 2 hours of mowing lawn, and he had 2 bars. So he did not get his order in that morning. There's been a lot of days that he ends up getting up at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody else is on the internet at that point in time, and then his order will go through a lot faster. So, one of the things that we're seeing in Wisconsin anyway is it seems like where there's cooperative owned lines, they're getting the proper broadband hookups. But anytime that it's private owned, we don't seem to be seeing that. So I think one of the things that hopefully the senators can work on is maybe opening it up so that the cooperative system can do more outreach into the private sector, because it seems like that's becoming more and more of a need, and it's really a hindrance for the rural economies, rural communities to bring in new businesses into rural Wisconsin, because they don't have that ability, and where we're at in society today, you really need to have some kind of internet access in order to just be involved in businesses, and it affects farmers too, with trying to work with the USDA and how they do their farm programs and make sure that they can do everything that they possibly can.
Yeah. Senator Baldwin, you've been such a vocal advocate for infrastructure investments. When Darren speaks, is this what you hear broadly in your state, or share with us a little more about why you're here on this issue?
Oh, absolutely. And first of all, I'm just delighted to join all of you to elevate the profile of the issues that we're here to discuss. I want to thank Darren for being here and sharing some of his experiences and those of the members that he leads with the Farmers Union. And I also want to join you in recognizing our other Wisconsinite, Jim Wessing, on today's panel. So let me talk a little bit about broadband infrastructure specifically, although I know we're here to address all of the rural infrastructure needs. But in particular, I have been traveling within the state to specifically hear about the challenges that rural communities face when when there's either no access or such slow speed access that becomes irrelevant. I actually have the Wisconsin map, which none of you can see from this distance, but as guidance to recognize how many communities and people we are leaving behind. We know that high-speed internet access is vital it is part of 21st century infrastructure. It is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And Darren was talking about a number of the ways in which it is a necessity economically, and we know that to be the case. But in addition, more and more today, it relates to our public health and individual health, as more and more of the interaction between medical providers and patients is actually conducted over the internet. And we know how essential it is in commerce and for education. I wanted to just share a few reflections of what happens when we leave people behind in our state. I remember first several years ago meeting a cheesemaker in Iowa County, Wisconsin, which is sort of southwestern part of the state, who has an award-winning product, but couldn't market it from his home. He had dial-up, and it wouldn't suffice, and so that was an additional burden. I want to sort of bookend that with a recent meeting that I had just a couple weeks ago when I was traveling the state during the August recess with a couple who had relocated from Chicago, Illinois, to a place called Spooner, Wisconsin, a very rural community. They are chocolatiers. One of the things that they mentioned in making that decision, again, just like the cheesemaker, award-winning, internationally recognized product. They said, when in Chicago, we looked at our market as Chicago. In Spooner, Wisconsin, we look at our market as the world. But that's not possible without the architecture and infrastructure of high-speed broadband. And yet, if it's there, that dream of having an internationally recognized business in a small rural community is absolutely an option. I wanted to just share a couple of other stories of the urgency of this. In Eagle River a few months back, I hosted a roundtable on high-speed broadband. Their community has done a technology survey and planning process. It's a tourist, a recreational area of the state, and they found that on average, their summer visitors would stay 2 extra weeks if they had access to high-speed broadband. 2 extra weeks multiplied by all of those visitors. What a ripple effect that has throughout that rural economy. Another example in southwestern Wisconsin, Greene County, where the local hospital that serves several counties in rural Wisconsin has now health information technology and electronic medical records. Great. If you don't have broadband, even making an appointment can be a challenge. But the money and resources that can be saved, as well as the health improved, by things such as saving an in-office visit post-surgery, by snapping a photo of your sutures healing, your wound closing, and being able to have the doctor say, that looks good, or that doesn't look good, please come in. You can't upload a photograph in rural Greene County to get it to your doctor to take advantage of these breakthroughs, these potential savings. So it is, I think, a critical challenge for us right now. Lastly, I want to just end on the note of anecdotal information of the impact on convincing young people to remain in rural areas unserved by high-speed internet. I can't tell you how many parents I've talked to recently who said, oh yes, the kids came home from college for the holidays, and within hours they were going batty because There was no ability to connect in the ways that they became accustomed to doing that during their college experience. No way to keep up with some of the assignments that they were scheduled to complete during the break. And it is something that will have an impact on the graying of our rural areas. As a active member of the Commerce Committee and as a member of the Democratic Senate Caucus that has pressed our new president to include broadband in his definition of infrastructure when we finally see the $1 trillion infrastructure package, you can be assured that we are fighting to make this a high, high priority.
Thank you so much, Senator Baldwin. That was powerful. Another fighter is Senator Tester. Senator Tester, you're a farmer. I've been with you on Big Sandy, and a member of the Ag Approach Subcommittee. So you're in a position to help us with this issue. Please tell us a little bit about the infrastructure needs as you see them in Montana and what your work here is focused on.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate the opportunity to visit about, quite frankly, who I am, and that's a farmer from rural America. And Lisa's been to the I can't even pronounce it, the big city of Big Sandy.
Maybe as big as this room.
And I just want to put something in perspective for you. When the national news reported on the Unabomber capture, and he was captured in Lincoln, Montana, they said he was captured in a very remote area of Montana. And Lisa's been to my town. She has probably been to Lincoln, but I'm here to tell you that Lincoln is populated compared to where I live. Okay? So we have an education process that we need to do, and everybody sitting in the audience is part of it, and the folks who live in rural America are a part of it that serve here in the Senate and in the House, because what we've seen over the last many years, and it's no different in Wisconsin or Montana or wherever you're from, is a mass exodus from rural America. Seen bigger farms, fewer farms, Main Street businesses close in wholesale fashions, banks move out. Hell, in Big Sandy, we've even lost some bars. And so, you know, it's getting bad. So here's the deal. I'm old enough where I should be thinking about retiring. The family farm's been in the family for 100 years. And we've had this mass exodus, and I got 2 kids that are perfectly capable of farming. And I always thought it was because of health care, and that was part of it, of them not moving back. But the real reason they're not moving back is probably the reason we all sit in this room and work for what we do, and that was their kids. There wasn't the opportunity. The school's gotten so small now that, you know, it's 6-man football, not 11-man football. It's the upper level classes are getting fewer and fewer, and most of those are done over the internet. So we have our challenges. But the bottom line is we also have some opportunity. I want to touch on 3 issues. I want to touch on broadband first, Farm Bill, and then I want to touch on program called Secure Rural Schools, which probably most of you don't know anything about, but my God. Let me say that again. Secure Rural Schools. I don't get applause all the time. There we go. So let's talk about broadband for a second. Critically important, very expensive, critically important. Mike Dolezal, the manager of Range, is probably going to talk after me. I don't want to set the agenda, but the fact is that we've got long distances between people in Montana. But the truth is we still need that service, and we need a service. Tammy spoke about it. We just don't need a service that's, now you got broadband. We need a service that's functional broadband. Because if we have functional broadband in rural America, there's an opportunity to bring people back to these communities that we've seen a mass exodus over the last 50, 60 years. Why? Because you'll be able to do business in any location. You're connected to the world when you're connected to the internet, if it's a good connection. So it is critically important we get that done. Is it expensive? You damn right it's expensive. It's more expensive than what one person could pay for to get broadband to their house. So it's going to have to be a nationwide effort. And we're all hopeful that we'll get a good infrastructure bill. We're all hopeful that infrastructure has broadband in it, and give the ability to folks like Mike at Range and other people who lay fiber throughout this country to be able to do that. I can tell you I'm a farmer. I'm not a technical person. But if we're able to do this, that means we'll be able to have people do business throughout the world from their location in a rural place, a very rural place in Montana. We're able to have people to be able to connect up for higher ed courses, to be able to improve themselves, to train up. We're able to have folks in hospitals connect up for telehealth, which is a huge problem in this country because we don't have enough docs, we don't have enough nurses. Telehealth is one of the solutions for that. And not only for emergency room services, which is what it's used for mostly in Montana right now, but also for mental health services. But you've got to have a good connection. Why? Because the other person on the other end of the line has to be able to see that twitch if they're talking to the person about mental health. And by the way, the patients that go in would prefer telehealth over a person sitting there. So broadband is critically important. I can tell you the only downside, and I say this without any knowledge, is this technology. And technology is changing so fast. What worries me is we'll lay the fiber, and tomorrow it'll be obsolete, and we'll have to lay something else. And we're talking about a lot of money. But nonetheless, we are where we are today, and we have to move forward. Opportunities there to be had, and if we don't. Second thing is Farm Bill, and I want to hit it really quick. We're taking input on a new Farm Bill. It's a big deal. We've got to have a safety net through crop insurance for our farmers and our ranchers out there. I think that's really important. If I would have my druthers about it, we'd have a very aggressive young farmer program to try to recruit the next generation of food producers back to the farm. And I think we've had it, thanks, thank you. I'm going to tell Manchin that I got more applause than he did. But I think that's really, really important. And then the other thing that probably won't be addressed in the Farm Bill, but I think should be addressed in the Farm Bill, and that's the marketplace. Our inputs are going through the roof in production agriculture. Why? Because consolidation in the marketplace. And it's happening in inputs right now. It happened in the sales side, the market side, many years ago when there's just a few companies that buy your product, and quite frankly, that's not good. We like capitalism. We want competition in the marketplace. Hopefully this next Farm Bill can deal with that in some way. It's something I'm going to advocate for. The last thing, and it's certainly not the least thing, is secure rural schools. If you come from a state west of the Mississippi, for sure there's a lot of federal lands. Some of that land is forested, some of it isn't. Secure rural schools money goes to the counties that have forested federal lands. Why? To take care of that tax base that doesn't happen. Now look, we're here lobbying for this kind of stuff. There's folks in the South and there's folks in the East that don't have any federal land. They say, why the hell should we give you guys any money for no good reason? Well, there is a good reason. Because it's federal land. Number one, there's not taxes paid on it, so this helps assume that burden. And the second thing is these counties have to survive. And this money isn't just put in the books for county commissioners to go flying around the world. Not at all. It's out there to help support the schools and help support infrastructure and the kind of work that counties do. So as we look forward to implementing a secure rural schools program that works and fully funded, it's going to be a challenge in a time where money is hard to come by. Appreciate y'all being here. Thanks, Lisa. You can come back to Big Sandy anytime.
Thanks, Senator. Mike, quickly, you're one of the true rural broadband providers in this room. So tell us, we don't have much time, but if you could tell folks, these are a lot of interested ears, where you need additional assistance, and what does it look from your shoes? Where is it?
Of course. Thanks, Lisa, for being part of today's get-together, and I appreciate having the opportunity to provide some comments. A little bit about what we've been able to accomplish at Range Telephone. Range Telephone itself, we provide service to 22,000 access lines. We've got 12,500 broadband lines. Over the years, we've been able to place over 4,000 miles of fiber optic cable while serving over 26,000 square miles. I'm the current president of the Montana Telephone Association. We have 9 members, and those 9 members collectively, we serve 70% of the state of Montana. Within that state, we have 75,000 homes, and we are serving 13,500 businesses We have placed over 20,000 miles of fiber optic facilities within our territory and have spent $248.6 million since year 2011. Investments in the small community are important, and the investments we do not only helps supplement the workforce, but the efficiencies it brings leads to better health care and education. With our recent study that was completed, as of the end of 2015, Montana was ranked #1 in the nation for telecommuting. So 1 of every 14 full-time employees in Montana telecommute. Healthcare has been mentioned here. The previous panel is continuing to be always a concern to us. Recent studies that are coming out show that by the year 2030, our population in Montana will be the 5th oldest in the nation. 76% of our population live outside of metro areas, which today ranks #1. Advancements in telemedicine, which our companies are providing and connecting up clinics and hospitals. There has never been a better access to medical care in our communities to address these services. On areas of education, 100% of our schools that are served by MTA members will be connected with fiber optic network by the end of 2017. Going along that line, taking a broader view, investing in rural America benefits to both the urban and rural areas. A report released last year by the Hudson Institute, working with the Foundation of Rural Services, determined that broadband companies investing in their areas have contributed $24.1 billion to the states that they operate in. Of that 24.1, 33%, or 8.2 billion, is accrued to the rural area. 66%, or 15.9 billion, accrues to the urban area. But as policymakers deliberate the upcoming Farm Bill, we should always be aware of how difficult it is for the rural broadband providers to have access to capital. Rural carriers like Range have a difficult time finding borrowers other than RUS, CoBank, and Rural Telecommunications Finance Corporation. All 3 lenders are sources my company has borrowed from and borrows from today. RUS has always been an important part of the rural telephone industry, and a comment I'd like to make in my past life career working with RUS, the benefits and how important these various grant programs are out there. I had a community that was a customer that had applied for a telemedicine and a Community Connect grant located in Salmon, Idaho. They had established a brand new hospital, they upgraded it, but they had trouble recruiting properly trained personnel, doctors, nurses, and by getting this telemedicine grant and Community Connect, they were able to build facilities and implement high-speed connections to train people within the community of Salmon and employ those same people who were making $8 or $9 an hour prior getting that training were now employed at the new hospital. So I urge Congress to continue supporting RUS Telecom and the broadband programs. You know, these programs finance loans that have to be paid back with interest. Yeah. And it's a win-win situation for both the broadband customer and taxpayers alike.
Mike, I'm going to stop you on win-win situation
for
broadband customers and the group alike. And you use the phrase that the access to capital for groups like yours is crucial, both at RUS and at CoBank and at CFC. I'm going to turn now to Senator Coons, who's been a big proponent of this whole question of access to capital and serves as the top Democrat on the Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee that funds something that is dear to my heart, which is the Community Development Financial Institutions. Senator Coons has been a fighter for money to get to the right places in America, including the places where it's hard to go in rural and urban America. So, Senator Coons, welcome, and please tell us more about your work in this broad area.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thanks for a chance to join this panel. I know that these great advocates for rural America, Senator Baldwin and Senator Tester and Senator Merkley, were wondering what the heck I was doing here, since relatively few people think of Delaware as this vast rural landscape of mostly federally owned lands and lots of free-ranging cattle and lots of forest fires. But what Senator Merkley knows is there's lots and lots and lots of chicken. I spent 10 years in county government, and the single largest export of Delaware agriculturally is chicken, but Sussex County, Delaware, exports more broiler chickens than any county in America. So while we may be small, we are mighty. And a lot of the issues that were raised in conversations before about access to infrastructure, whether it's broadband, electricity, or literally transportation infrastructure, is essential for Delaware. We can't export our agricultural products if we don't have quick and ready access both to broadband and to ports and to highways. And one of the things I've worked on is making sure that we have access to the growing and hungry markets of the world so that a tremendous, high-protein, tasty, easy to deliver agricultural product from my state and many others makes it there. I'll stop with the chicken ads. Now, access to capital is something that is critical to manufacturing. I worked for 8 years for a Delaware-based manufacturing company and became familiar with manufacturing extension. You may not be familiar with it, but it has worked exceptionally well in Delaware. It works in many small communities and is particularly good at helping sustain manufacturing with some of the operational challenges of the modern world environment. I'll let Jim talk more about intellectual property and manufacturing and innovation. That's his bailiwick. But we all know ag extension and the model and why it works and what it does. You may or may not know that manufacturing extension is built on the ag extension model and does the same thing. CDFIs, or Community Development Finance Institutions, exist to make loans in communities that otherwise are not bankable or are not getting the attention of the big players in the big cities who are mostly interested in complex financial structured instruments and don't anymore do relationship giving of the type that is really appropriate in rural communities where you understand each other and you understand whether or not you're a good credit risk. CDFIs make available affordable and patient capital in rural communities all over the country, and they have an economic development mission. So they've got a 30-year track model, a 30-year track record of a relationship lending model that has been very successful in sustaining economic development in rural communities, whether it's in helping start new businesses, finance community projects, or helping families afford a home. There are many in Delaware. I'll just mention NCALL, one I've done a lot of work with in Dover that is particularly effective in outreach to rural communities. This is a piece of the larger puzzle. What we're talking about today is infrastructure. So whether it's a rural electric cooperative, which in Delaware we have a very successful, very progressive one, whether it's a telephone cooperative, whether it's other ag cooperatives or extension, I think access to capital is a key piece of it. Know that we've got 3 senators here who are tremendous advocates for rural America. And although our piece of rural America may be small, it's a critical part of our state, our culture, and our economy. And I'm grateful for the chance to be with you today on this panel, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Appreciate that. Now, the Steering and Outreach Committee brilliantly organized this panel. So you were sitting next to a manufacturer, Jim, and I want to bring Jim into this, who is a founder. And Jim, you know the business side of this issue. You know the value of infrastructure investments. So tell us a little bit more about the value of public investments. And we're picking up the pace, so go to your key points because you know them.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief.
Condex employs 200 people in Lamira, Wisconsin. Lamira is a small community of about 1,500 people. And this is a company I started in 1974 on my great-grandfather's farm. And we ship products to 19 different countries, and in the last 5 years, we've been awarded 11 patents. And I wanted to speak today a little bit for the manufacturing sector in that it's very difficult in America to get a patent. It's a very difficult process, and we really need to do some reforms in the patent area here in America. And also the R&D tax credit, there were never any rules written for it, and it's very difficult to really utilize the R&D tax credit, which was really designed to drive innovation in America. So those are 2 points I wanted to make today. Secondly, regarding the manufacturing industry, manufacturers of farm equipment support about 320,000 jobs nationwide. In Wisconsin, we support 98,000 jobs. It's a big business in Wisconsin, 13,000 jobs in Oregon, and hundreds more in Montana and Delaware. Our industry generated $159 billion for the U.S. GDP last year, so it's a very large industry. The 4 points I wanted to talk about here briefly was, number one, Washington needs to have the equipment manufacturers back. All of us have the opportunity to advance a few simple pro-farm, pro-manufacturing policies, and they are, number one, we need a robust farm bill that supports the American farmer, and basically we need a good crop insurance program in this new farm bill. Number two, we need to protect the renewable fuel standard. And we have a lot of innovation going on using waste materials to, and utilizing enzymes to produce ethanol much cheaper than some other sources of energy. We really need to support that. The American farmer really has done a good job in that area. Number three, we've talked about it a little bit, we need to rebuild America's infrastructure, not only just our roads and our bridges and our waterways, but we need high-speed wireless broadband in rural America. And I want to emphasize wireless broadband. Most of our equipment that we're producing today collects all kinds of data for the farmer. This is all being transmitted off the field as the farmer is operating this equipment. So I think that's really important. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is we need to pass some common sense tax reform. And I'm talking about tax reform that protects the American farmer and protects the American manufacturer and allows us to sell our products globally around the world. So thank you very much for being on this panel today.
Jim, you got the right ears around you. Thank you very much. Okay, we are rounding into the last part of this panel, and you got my two states, my home state of Oregon and my adopted marriage state of North Carolina to wind us down. Senator Merkley, welcome. You're the top Democrat on the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds the USDA Rural Development Loan and Grant Programs. You were a champion of so many of these critical programs. So take us to the fight now. How is the committee trying to address?
Lisa, thank you so much. It's great to be with you all, and I want to double down on everything that Senator Tester said about secure rural schools. So important for the federal government to maintain and honor its commitment to our counties. And while I should mention that Montana and Idaho and Washington, Oregon are aflame, they are burning, and a lot of that is because we don't have the funds for fire resilience to thin those forests and be able to trim up the branches so that the lightning strike fires don't go to the canopy. It's an enormous loss. We have to end fire borrowing for fighting fires, in which we drain the programs for preventing fires. And we need a lot more funds to be able to do that. Turning to the bill, the Ag Approps bill, I wanted to focus on the amendment that the Democrats put forward that said three things really need a lot more money. One was water infrastructure, clean water supply, wastewater treatment. As I go around to my 36 town halls each year and meet with the county officials and city officials beforehand, almost every community has an enormous infrastructure challenge in providing clean water or treating wastewater, and that ability is essential to the growth and preservation of those communities. So we proposed in that bill funding that would enable another $2 billion in grants for clean water and wastewater treatment. Now, it's one thing to have a good farm bill and authorization, but this is where the rubber hits the road. It's where we spend the money. And then, so there's a lot of talk about broadband, absolutely essential for every reason everyone said. So what did we do? We added another $1 billion of lending ability for rural broadband, but that's only, I got to say, that another $1 billion would be helpful, but it's not nearly enough. And then let's talk about housing. How many times have you gone to a community that says, we got some nibbles for a company to come here, and then they said, oh, we don't have enough places for workers to live, and this company ends up going to some other community that has more housing available. And yet you can't get people to come in and build the housing at a moment when there aren't people coming to the community to buy the housing or rent the housing. So we're caught in that paralysis. So additional funding and support for rural housing was a third key component. There's many other pieces that were in the Democratic alternative to amplify, including environmental quality incentive programs, emergency conservation, forest restoration, emergency watershed, and so forth. But those three, water, broadband, and housing, may be the three legs of a stool for greatly amplifying the success of rural America, and we need to do a lot more in those three areas. And thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mark. Curtis, you're going to round us out for today. You are responsible for providing electric service that's affordable for consumers in a very rural part of North Carolina. So help us conclude today by talking about what it is that you see as the needs and what you can provide. And I know Roanoke has used almost all of those programs that Senator Merkley has just spoke about. So help us conclude today.
Yes, Lisa, thank you for the opportunity, and Senator Merkley, as he leaves, for all of his support and all of the senators on the panel. Rural electric cooperatives, just for 80 years, have had a very good partnership with the Rural Utility Services, USDA, and we just want to mention a few success stories in terms of things that we've been able to accomplish as a result of that relationship. And then moving forward into a topic that is very near and dear to everyone's heart, and that's with broadband and how that's shaping up. With the loan program for infrastructure, we have had about $5.5 billion per year to invest in our communities, coming to us as loans that have not really cost the government, and we've been able to capitalize on that and pay our interest notes, our loan notes back, and make that work for rural communities. New is in the area of energy efficiency, and this is an area that when a new program just came out, there were two actually, the Rural Energy Conservation Program and the Energy Efficiency Conservation Loan Program. Our community, which is in northeastern North Carolina, was really dying for those programs to happen. The constant cycle of the cooperative being accused of having rates too high because of everyone's electric bill being enormous during those very cold and very hot times of the year was mainly around consumption that was tied to poor energy efficiency measures. We have been able to use this program to support over 250 homes, to make investments into those homes to lower their utility bills. And if you can address pocketbook issues in rural communities, which mostly are poor areas, you're really hitting a home run, and that program has been very successful for us. The other is an area that is somewhat new, and that's in the renewable energy sector. And with programs that help support community solar, we've been able to make access to renewable energy accessible to anyone, whether they're a renter or they live in an area where there are shade trees, it doesn't matter. With community solar projects, the utility is taking the lead in providing renewable energy so that everyone can participate no matter where they live. And then energy services programs, which get into things that in our state, like smart thermostats, which tie really into the energy efficiency programs, water heater control element controls that can lower the demand for electricity have been big successes that have come through some of the programs that we've had access to. Now, just to speak about telecommunications need, particularly broadband, what we're finding as a cooperative is that broadband and cooperative operations are beginning to merge together. To run a smart utility, you have to have access to broadband. And we're in the early stages of a project right now where we're connecting all of our substations with fiber communications. And the goal is to expand that out to every home within our service territory. Why would we do that? Aside from the need that we've all been talking about, whether it's in healthcare, education, but we need it for smart operations so that every member can help us reduce the cost of electricity that we purchase on the wholesale level. And that's a big thing for us to be able to do, and we're combining that as a part of our operations. We're looking at a major investment in providing fixed wireless communications into our region so that we can make sure that that's available. We're seeing that as a huge opportunity. Now, many co-ops other than us are developing plans, and one thing I want to make sure I emphasize is that although we make the parallel of what happened in the 30s to what could happen now with electric cooperatives providing a solution, there are some differences. When we started 80 years ago, we were investing in poles and wires and transformers, which had a very long shelf life. We've got some of that equipment still on our system 80 years later. Now, with telecommunications, it's a completely different story. The shelf life for 5G, we don't know if it's going to be 5 years, 3 years, or what the case may be. For any type of broadband investment, you've got to keep that in mind, and that's a part of the equation that all of our systems are looking at. And I have to say that when you see one cooperative, we have a saying in our industry, of the 900 cooperatives, when you see one cooperative, you've seen one cooperative. One size definitely does not fit all. What's maybe unique for North Carolina and Roanoke specifically may not have the same circumstances for a cooperative that's in South Dakota or in a whole nother state with a totally different set of circumstances. So we think that, just to wrap it up, co-ops are in a good position, but there are some things we're being very careful about as we look at how we can push and help support broadband initiatives and making it a part of our overall operations. And as we look at how we can work with our organizations on the telephone side, one thing I just want to be very clear about, as an example in our area, we don't have a telephone cooperative that serves that particular area. So we know that we have some parallel paths that are working here that can help address these issues, both on the electric cooperative side as well as the telephone cooperative side that really need to be looked at. So thank you, Lisa, and
thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
We end on a good note. To help join me in thanking this entire panel. And we leave you in good hands with Senator Klobuchar and Steve Case. So thank you all.
The issue with the R&D tax credit are the rules.
It is.
That's exactly the deal.
Sorry.
Excuse me.
Is it on? Yeah. great. Huh? McAuliffe. He's always there. Yeah, he just has a lot of energy. Like we had like 15 senators. Okay, everyone, I think if you want to have a seat, we're going to get started. I hope you've had a great morning since I left you. I had a few hearings to go to and things, but you look like not worse for the wear, so that's good. We are so pleased to have you all here still for our incredible keynote speaker. And he is a true example as we talk about rural development and how it's not all about farming, but it is also about businesses and how when we're in this world where we want to have more startups or we're going to fall behind, we want to have the next Apple, or as we say in Minnesota, the next 3M or the next Best Buy, or I won't go on and on. We have to look not just in our urban areas, but our rural areas as well. And in fact, I'd argue with the cost of living less in rural areas, we actually could make an argument that we should be trying to push some of the startups into rural areas. So here's Steve. He co-founded America Online, as you all know, in 1985. He, at the time, ran the world's largest and most valuable internet company. At its peak, half of internet users in the U.S. used AOL, and nearly everyone still had that voice from the past. Remember this? You've got mail stuck in their head. After stepping down as CEO following AOL's merger with Time Warner, Steve dedicated himself to helping entrepreneurs. He currently serves as chairman and CEO of Revolution LLC, a Washington, D.C.-based firm that invests in new companies. He served the founding chair of the White House Startup America Partnership, an effort to accelerate high-growth entrepreneurship throughout the nation, and then he created Rise of the Rest, and that is where I'm actually going to start with my questions of Steve, because that is where I got to see him in action. His team has been on bus tours to tech hubs across the country, ones that maybe are a tech hub because they only have one tech company, but they're a hub. He has been to 26 cities, traveling more than 6,000 miles, and that's why he ranked #4 in Politico's 50 Ideas Blowing Up Washington. There's a lot of things that are blowing up Washington right now, but we're always pleased when they're ideas. That's a really good thing. And so I was really stunned when I got to accompany him for the morning at this Rise of the Rest bus tour in the Twin Cities, because I could not believe the people coming out of the woodwork with their ideas, and then they presented them to him, and then they evaluate them, and then they get you'll explain, a loan grant for their own startup so that they can start small and then grow. So with that, I'm going to ask your first question, Steve, and that is, tell us about that and what's the concept and how is it going?
Well, first of all, it's great to see everybody here, and thank you for kind of sharing this effort to shine a spotlight on what's happening in kind of rural parts of the country. I think it's very important, and it's particularly important if you look at the sort of the job creation, economic growth, side of things. The way I look at it is 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. Really just an idea, a pretty fragile idea. And the reason we're now the leader of the free world is because we've had the leading economy, and that wasn't an accident. That was work of entrepreneurs all over the country. And we kind of led the way with the agricultural revolution. We led the way with the industrial revolution. We led the way with the digital revolution, the technology revolution. And that's why we're so strong. So that's a wonderful thing, a kind of a pioneering spirit. But as you know, because you're working on these issues, right now it does matter, where you live. In terms of whether you have a real shot at the American dream. And the data here is pretty sobering. Last year, 75% of venture capital went to 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts. And actually, mostly went to 3 cities in 3 states, mostly in the San Francisco area. A lot of parts of California, I'm sure some of you are in them that are struggling. In New York, most of it went to New York City. There are many parts of New York that are struggling, and a lot went to Boston. There are many parts of Massachusetts that were struggling. And so essentially, our innovation economy now, the engine of growth for our country now, is really centered in three places. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's wrong, and it's not going to position us for the future. So we have to really level the playing field and get more capital flowing to more entrepreneurs, in the process create more jobs in more communities, more of a sense of hope and possibility. And that really led to this Rise of the Rest effort. How do we visit, kind of places around the country and tell their stories? The entrepreneurs there encourage people in those communities to work together more collaboratively to create more of a network within each of these cities to support the startups. And the reason that's so important is if you look at the job creation data, and Kauffman Foundation does great research on this, really all the net jobs in the country come from startups. Small business in aggregate is very important, accounts for a lot of jobs, but it doesn't account for a lot of net jobs. A new restaurant, opens on Main Street, usually replacing a restaurant that was there on Main Street. The number of jobs it ends up being the same. Fortune 500 companies, the big companies, in aggregate account for a lot of jobs, but don't account for a lot of job growth because some are growing, some are declining. So the job growth has to come from the startups. And if we're only backing the entrepreneurs in a few places like Silicon Valley, and they're doing disruptive things that in some cases destroy jobs in the middle of the country, and we're not at least partially offsetting that by backing the entrepreneurs in the middle of the country who can create jobs there. I think we're missing out. And one example that happened over the last half century, just happened to meet with one of the Waltons yesterday, is Bentonville, Arkansas, half a century ago was 4,000 people, 5,000 people. Now it's grown more than tenfold because of the success of Walmart. And a lot of other communities around Bentonville have benefited that. So if you're rising and you're attracting capital and you're keeping and attracting people and you're creating jobs, it's a great thing. But right now it's happening in too few places, and that's why it's so important that we try to level the playing field.
Very good. So when you look at all the communities across the country, we'll just give you a sense who's from the Midwest here. Who's from the Midwest? There we are. Oh, they're in the front row, a lot of them. Of course they are. And anyone from the Western area and the South? Yep, see? There's a lot of there. Yeah, they sit together. Yeah, I can tell right over there. And the East Coast, Northeast. And so, okay. So you can see we have people from all over the country.
Anybody from Hawaii?
South.
Yeah.
Hawaii, yeah, okay, excellent. And so, as you think about their regions of the country, how do they start attracting this kind of tech hubs and that kind of business to rural areas and not just to the big cities?
Well, it obviously takes time, but it starts with in the community creating a more of a connected community. We talked a lot about in the earlier panel around infrastructure and particularly broadband. And obviously, it's critically important. My own experience with getting America online was really trying to educate people about the benefits of getting online. And when we got started in 1985, only 3% of people were online. And they're only online 1 hour a week. So we didn't live in a connected world. Now we do. Most people are connected, but as you well know, there's also a big divide between the communities that are connected with broadband, the communities still relying on dial-up, and that does limit the ability for some businesses to grow. Some of the interesting commerce platforms like Etsy, right now 28% of their sellers are in rural America. So they have some ability to connect, but there's often limited, particularly if they want to be in the entertainment business or the financial services business or other sectors of the economy. Having broadband becomes much more important. But it's not just about the technology in terms of that connectivity. It's also about the community connectivity. And in many of the places we visit, people aren't really celebrating the entrepreneurs. They aren't really, kind of helping to champion them and back them. And since they're the big job creators, I think it's important that you do that. And also, it's critically important that we focus on the talent side of the equation. And some of that obviously is schools and education and reskilling, but some of it's also trying to essentially slow the brain drain that's happened in so many parts of the country where people growing up, were told to leave. The opportunity isn't here, it's elsewhere. How do you slow that so there's more opportunities to stay and also create a little bit of a boomerang of talent where people feel maybe now it's time to come back? And that's only going to happen if there's a sense of momentum and there's sort of a sense of job growth. So there's a bunch of things that need to happen. It's obviously not going to happen overnight, but I think partly being intentional and saying this is something the communities need to do, technology needs to enable, and also public policy, which is why forums like this are so important, needs to encourage and incent. I think there are things that can be done to encourage more investment capital to back more entrepreneurs in more places, including in rural communities. And there's actually some legislation that was introduced, all the Investing in Opportunity Act, that has bipartisan support. Cory Booker and Tim Scott were co-sponsors of it, that basically is trying to create some incentives, or sort of deferral of capital gains to get more capital flowing to more places. So you got to fire on all these different kind of cylinders to really kind of get this moving. But it's not just waiting for Washington to do policy things, not just waiting for the investors in California, New York to get on planes to visit. It's also trying to do what you can within your community to really celebrate startups and create a more interesting environment to get people to really take the risk of starting companies, and in the process, the ones that are successful, creating jobs.
So what do you see as advantages? I'll tell one little story from my state. This Washington Post reporter, he did a story, my Minnesotans know about this, on the ugliest county in the country. And by some weird USDA calculation, it came up as Redwood Falls, the town, that county in Minnesota. And so he then got so much pushback from Minnesotans that lived in that area, and it's actually kind of pretty on the Canadian border, that he agreed to come visit it. He then wrote this beautiful mea culpa story about he had gone rafting, he had, Colin Peterson, Representative Peterson's Second Amendment band played at a bar for him, they did all this stuff. Okay, the story doesn't end there, and he said, I was totally wrong. He then moved his family there. I'm not kidding. He lives there now, and he still writes for the Washington Post. He's doing a book. I went and I met him. I went and had dinner at his house with his kids, and he made the biggest steaks I couldn't eat for 2 days that his neighbor had given him, and it's a big farming area, and so it's really worth looking at the story. It is so funny. So, but I just and he just loved it because of the fact that so he's doing he's like a digital reporter for them, and I think they had Wi-Fi, so he managed there. But he loved the more low-key environment. He loved having more space. He loved the fact that his neighbors were different and weren't all on top of each other, that he could go outdoors, that he could go rafting, that he could do all these things. So talk a little bit about how this could actually work if let's just say we get the broadband done, okay, and people get interconnected. We know that's a major, major thing. But how do we sell doing startups in these small communities as opposed to, yes, we know there's challenges. We need the cool workspace, the internet cafe if we're going to grow bigger to scale. But at the beginning, when it's just 2 or 3 people or 4 people starting a, rye business like they have in Halleck, Minnesota, which is super cool to drink scotch at, 10 in the morning. I did that. So what,
So where's the scotch now?
No, okay. So what? So where? So what are? Talk about some of the advantages of these startups in the rural areas and how you, as a businessman who sold something really big, could sell this.
Well, I think first of all, most of you know it because you're living it. There are, as you just said, a lot of kind of lifestyle advantages, huge cost of living advantages, the cost of operating companies now in places like Silicon Valley, crazy. I mean, it's the part of the reason they have to raise so much capital is it's so expensive to hire people. It's so expensive to office space, apartments, everything is super expensive. So there's that aspect to it. But the other aspect I think is going to become much more important in the next decade. And I've talked about this. I wrote a book last year called The Third Wave, and the way I frame it, the first wave of the internet was getting everybody connected, going from something that nobody knew about or cared about to suddenly something you couldn't live without. Then the second wave, the last 15 years or so, has really been building apps and services on top of the internet, Facebook and Twitter and so forth, really about software. The third wave is really integrating the internet in much more seamless and pervasive, sometimes even invisible ways, throughout our lives. And the process really challenged, disrupt, revolutionize some big sectors of the economy like healthcare and education, energy, transportation, food, agriculture, things like that. They've changed a little bit in the first wave and second wave, but not that much. but we're going to change a lot in the third wave. But unlike the second wave, where it was mostly about software and therefore mostly about coding, the third wave is going to also be about partnerships, collaboration. If you want to revolutionize healthcare, it's not about an app. It's actually about working with doctors and nurses to make sure they integrate it into how they do things, and work with hospitals to get it integrated, and health plans to get it paid for, and the government to understand some of the regulatory issues, and that expertise, cultural expertise about how that sector works, the credibility to be able to go in and walk into some hospital and have them take you seriously, is going to require a different perspective than we had, I think, in the second wave. I think that's going to advantage what we call these rise of the rest cities. I think that domain expertise, if you will, that credibility is going to become much more important. And take agriculture as a sector. Obviously, it's always been critical in this country. I mentioned the agriculture revolution. 200 years ago, over 90% of us worked on farms, by the way. Now it's under 2% because of technology. We've figured out ways to be more efficient. There's a lot of people trying to figure out what's the next wave of innovation in agriculture, what they call ag tech. My bet is, while some of those insights, some of those innovations may very well come from a place like Silicon Valley, they're also going to come from the middle of the country that actually understands farming. And some of the communities like St. Louis, Louisville, Lincoln, some of these places that actually have deep expertise in farming. So that notion of marrying the technology, the software, if you will, with kind of real world understanding of these sectors and the credibility to establish partnerships in these sectors, I think really is going to kind of define this. And the other piece of it, and I know it's not entirely good news for a group focused on kind of the smaller rural kind of parts of the country. The first step, and I think the key focus, at least for our efforts over the next 5 years, is really trying to get capital, instead of it going to 3 cities, going to 30 cities. So maybe a little less in San Francisco, New York, and Boston, a little more in Minneapolis or Des Moines or Pittsburgh or cities like that. They're still cities, but they're second or third, sometimes even fourth tier cities. If we're successful in doing that, that will give people in these rural communities a little bit more of a choice. Some of them now feel like, in order to pursue opportunity, they have to leave the whole area and move to the coasts. At least if they're in rural, Minnesota, having an opportunity to maybe move an hour or two away to Minneapolis or someplace like that, gives them that that option. That's the first step. How do we get more capital going to more cities and have the innovation economy more dispersed? But that doesn't directly impact the the rural opportunity. That comes next, and trying to get it then after you get it from 3 to 30 to 300 and have broader distribution because of broadband, where actually more company creation can happen in these rural areas, and people actually can stay there and still have great opportunities. So it's going to take some time, but we need to, as a first step, kind of educate people that there are great entrepreneurs doing great things that have great insights everywhere, not just in a few places, and get more capital kind of flowing there.
I think one of the things I get a little bit debate with my colleagues is I always say, well, small business, got to help small business, not big business. And yet, what I've seen, we have 18 Fortune 500 companies. I always like to tease our mutual friend, Mark Warner, that Minnesota has a higher per capita Fortune 500 companies than Virginia, but then he says per capita. Okay, but we have 18 Fortune 500.
I'm glad I wasn't here when McAuliffe was talking.
Yeah,
you guys would go at it.
Okay, but so the idea here is that I debate some of our other colleagues, not Mark, about this, because the small businesses are intricately related, and the small businesses know this, often to the big businesses. Those are their customers. They sell things to them. And yet you don't want the small businesses cut off and marginalized into nothing or taken over all the time, but yet that is one of their biggest customers. So can you talk about how we improve things so that the big businesses are working better with our small, and whatever we can do to incentivize these small businesses, especially in the rural parts of our country?
No, I think there's good progress on that front. I think in the second wave there was sort of a little bit of a standoff. Some of the people doing innovative things in places like Silicon Valley weren't really talking to the larger companies, and the larger companies weren't really paying much attention to what they were doing. It's kind of off there on the side. But now, as this shift goes into this, as I said, the third wave, it becomes much more important for the smaller companies, the startups, to partner with the bigger companies to get the credibility, to get the distribution in healthcare and some of these other sectors, but also quite important for the larger companies to partner with the smaller companies to get the benefit of their insights and the agility they have in terms of thinking differently and moving quickly. So there's a really important need for more partnerships, and the communities that do a good job of fostering that. I think what we saw when we were in the Twin Cities was a good example of that, are going to be the winners in the third wave. It's how do you create more connections between the small companies and the big companies, more connections with the universities where some of the ideas, some of the innovations are happening. Creating more of a network within your community is going to become critically important as one of the core, I think, ingredients that's going to lead to kind of successful communities. I also should point out, I mentioned the startups create the job growth and in aggregate, not small businesses. It's also obviously true that every big business starts as a small business, and some of those small businesses, if given more capital and given more mentoring and more inspiration, aspiration, can be big businesses. Something like, even I mentioned Walmart. It was a store in Bentonville. And they went pretty well. And they started adding more and more and more, and now it's one of the largest companies in the world. Even in the non-tech sectors like Five Guys burgers, it was a burger joint. Chipotle was like something in Denver selling burritos, and ends up expanding, and some of these now have hundreds of thousands of jobs. And they started as small businesses. The difference is they had the aspiration to not just have that one burrito shop in Denver, but actually, they have now 1,000 or whatever the number is, and they were able to access the capital and attract the talent to take that idea and scale it. So, are there some small businesses in some of your communities that actually have the potential to be bigger businesses if you surround them with support, including some of the capital, so they can have the possibility of not just having one thing in your community, but maybe it's a regional cluster of things, or maybe it ends up being national, maybe it ends up being global. I guarantee you, when Sam Walton started that little company in Bentonville and said we're going to just figure out ways to provide products to people in rural America at lower prices with better selection, he had no idea it would end up being one of the largest companies in the world. So what are the ideas out there that might be in your communities that could spark that wave of innovation and job growth?
Okay, just one last question, and that is that we've the Farm Bill coming up, and I know today we've talked a lot about some of the USDA programs on energy development. We've talked about infrastructure investments. And I think one of the things that we'll want to do, people advocating for those programs, and then people like me who are making the decisions to make our cases, is that it's not just, the rural areas need this money. I think it's also about how it ties into fostering this startups which help the whole country. So anything you could do along those lines, examples of these startups that are not just in urban areas, will be very helpful for us, and why it's important to have them throughout the whole country.
Now, we've seen, as Senator said in the introduction, we've now, on these Rise of the Rest road trips, we've visited 26 cities, 6,000 miles. We're about to do another 8 cities in October. This time we're joined by a new colleague and partner, J.D. Vance. I don't know how many of you have read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, a great book, and bestseller. He just joined our Rise of the Rest effort because he too, having kind of written about the challenges of some of these communities in terms of job loss and opioid and education issues and so forth, wants to not just be kind of defining some of the problems, but be part of a solution. And so he's joining us, has joined us at my firm Revolution, particularly focused on the Rise to Rest. And in all these different cities, we've just seen remarkable entrepreneurs doing remarkable things in a wide range of sectors. And I think one of the things we have to move away from is even thinking of things as tech startups. It needs to be much, kind of a much broader definition. There's very innovative things that are happening in almost every sector now of our economy. And what are the opportunities in your communities to kind of help champion, as I said, some of the entrepreneurs that can take that on. So I'm not certainly an expert in the Farm Bill, but as you suggested, some bridge to some of these things that could provide more more capital, more investment capital for these startups, like the Investing in Opportunity Act is important. It's not directly related to the Farm Bill, but as several people have said today, as we have this discussion around infrastructure, the broadband digital infrastructure, I'd argue, is the most important. Yes, we need to do better roads and bridges and airports and stuff like that, but in the next century, the digital infrastructure is going to be much more important than the physical infrastructure. So that's a challenge, but also an opportunity. But it starts with really just shining a spotlight on the issues and not just view it as problems to solve, but opportunities to seize.
Okay, good. I'm going to quote you on that one when we divide up the money, when we finally get that thing rolling, that's more important than the roads. I really believe this, because I just see this as, it's not just getting goods to market, it's how you get the goods there to begin with to be produced. And if we don't have the internet so that they can reach customers, we're not going to be able to do that. So anyway, well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today, Steve. Maybe you can hang around just a little bit, People want to give you their AOL number or something. I still have an AOL account.
That's why I like you so much.
But thank you, Steve. And I'll just say a few closing remarks. Just hold on.
Great, thanks.
Let's thank Steve. Okay. First of all, I want to thank everyone that put this together today. David McMaster, where are you? The head, right over here, the head of steering and outreach. He did a great job. Eduardo, right there, also works with us. Claire, right over there. Thank you, Claire. Laura Pinsky, right? And then, of course, Rayshawn, thank you so much for your work on this as well. And we always want to thank the interns, right? Alex, Josh, Wanda, Habiba, and Alex. So thank you, interns. And I think I'm not going to go on and on here because you guys have been sitting so long and have been the greatest audience ever. But we're really excited about some of the things we learned here. It gives us fodder to go back to our colleagues, make the case not just for the Farm Bill, but for economic development. I hope you got some new ideas, heard from some incredible people when I was here, so you can bring those back as well. I always like to remind people, my husband's the third of 6 boys, and twice his parents left him at the gas station because he was such a good kid, and they drove away in their station wagon and forgot him. So we are not going to let rural America be left at the gas station in the next few years. Let's get going. Thank you, everybody.